Welcome back to Animal Quests. These shark attacks have one chilling thing in common. The victims never believed they were the ones in danger. From a videographer who waded into a baited harbor just to film a tiger shark up close, to a film crew that ignored a confirmed shark sighting in False Bay, South Africa, and sent 4 stunt divers into the water anyway. It was May 27, 2014, along a fog-shrouded stretch of the Central California coast, where the morning sat cold and gray, and the horizon had all but disappeared into the mist. The water was a flat, steely color, the swell rolling in slow and heavy, and the beach behind it was nearly empty, the parking area holding only a handful of cars at that early hour. Bryson Hale, 31, was a software engineer who spent nearly every weekend in the water. He had been surfing for years and considered himself experienced, the kind of surfer who knew the breaks, read the swell, and rarely let conditions change his plans. Friends knew him as someone who tended to dismiss the safety concerns other surfers raised, treating warnings as the nervous talk of people less comfortable in the ocean than he was. To me, that's what this whole story comes down to. Confidence helped him in the water until it made him ignore the warning that mattered most. For several weeks before that morning, large numbers of seals had been hauling out and gathering near the section of coastline Bryson liked best. Their presence had not gone unnoticed. Several shark sightings had been reported by surfers, fishermen, and lifeguards over the previous weeks, and word had spread through the local surf community. Many regulars had quietly started avoiding the spot altogether, choosing breaks farther up or down the coast until the seals thinned out and the sharks moved on. Bryson knew all of this. He had heard the reports, he had seen the seals himself, and he had been told directly by other surfers that they were staying away. He went out anyway, which is the point, in my opinion, where this stopped being an unlucky encounter and started being a decision. That foggy morning, with the visibility poor and almost no one else in the water, he paddled out and then kept going. A few surfers had initially gone out at dawn, but had already left after seeing seals gathering unusually close to the lineup. Bryson pushed farther offshore than usual in search of the larger, cleaner waves forming beyond the main break. The combination worked against him at every level. Low visibility meant he could not see what was beneath or around him. The heavy seal activity meant the water was already attracting predators, and his position out past everyone else placed him alone, on the edge of a known hunting zone, in exactly the kind of setting where these animals feed. Great white sharks are among the most powerful predators in the ocean, capable of reaching lengths well over 15 feet and weighing more than 2,000 pounds. Along the Central California coast, they feed heavily on seals and sea lions, and they hunt using a signature ambush strategy, holding deep below their target and then rushing upward in a single explosive strike. From the surface, a surfer lying flat on a board, arms and legs dangling, presents a silhouette unsettlingly similar to a seal, especially in murky, low-light water. Where the seals gather, the great whites follow, and the conditions that morning checked every box. The attack came from directly beneath him. Several people on shore later reported seeing a sudden explosion of white water around him, a single violent ambush that seemed to come out of nowhere. There was almost no warning. Witnesses saw only a brief disturbance before he disappeared from view, and by the time other surfers and rescuers could reach the area, his injuries were unsurvivable. The strike, delivered by an animal of that size moving at full speed, had caused catastrophic damage, and there was nothing anyone in the water could meaningfully do. He did not survive. Recovery and response took place over the hours that followed, and the beach was closed while authorities assessed the area. Wildlife experts who reviewed the circumstances later said the incident was consistent with known great white hunting behavior, low visibility, heavy seal activity, a lone surfer positioned beyond the group, and an ambush strike from below. The story drew local and regional coverage for a few days, the kind that briefly reopens the conversation about sharks before quietly fading. Among the surfers who knew the spot, it confirmed what they had already feared, and most of them stayed away from that break for the rest of the season. Looking back, this one is difficult to file under bad luck. Bryson did not wander into an unknown risk. He paddled into a spot he had been specifically warned about, on a morning when the conditions could hardly have been worse, and he pushed himself farther out than anyone else. He trusted his own experience over every signal telling him to stay in. It was July 14th, 2016. And the southern Atlantic churned under heavy gray skies along the western Cape coast of South Africa. The water temperature had dropped into the low 50s, and the seasonal concentration of prey species had drawn massive aggregations of marine life toward the coastline. Cape fur seal colonies along the offshore islands were at peak population. Hundreds of animals hauled out on rocky platforms and porpoising through the shallows, and with them came the predators that had patrolled these waters since before human memory. Cerise Viljoen was a 24-year-old marine biology student at the University of Cape Town, entering the final year of her degree. She had grown up in the coastal suburb of Muizenberg, where the ocean had shaped her childhood and eventually her career ambitions. Her academic focus centered on elasmobranch ecology, and she had spent the previous semester cataloging shark movement data from tagged animals along the Western Cape. But her open water experience remained limited to supervised university dives in controlled environments. She had never been in open water near a seal colony. The operation she booked was run by Dolph Grayling, a 51-year-old former commercial fisherman who had shifted into wildlife tourism 3 years earlier. Grayling operated from a converted fishing vessel, running unlicensed in-water snorkeling excursions near seal colonies at rates that undercut legitimate operators by half. His business lacked several required safety certifications, and he routinely placed swimmers in the water within prohibited proximity of seal islands. He did not use the protective cage systems that legitimate operators employed as standard equipment. That morning, Grayling brought 6 clients to a site within prohibited proximity of a known seal colony. The water was thick with particulate, visibility often dropping below 10 feet in the plankton blooms stirred up by winter swells. A low cloud ceiling darkened the surface further. Viljoen entered the water with 3 other clients. The overcast conditions and murky water meant her silhouette was backlit against the brighter surface above, a dark, irregular shape suspended between the boat and the seal colony. From depth in the reduced visibility, the profile could resemble a seal from below. Great white sharks are the largest predatory shark species on Earth, with adults commonly reaching lengths of 15 to 20 feet and weights exceeding 4,000 pounds. Their hunting strategy near seal colonies relies on high-speed vertical ambush attacks launched from depth, striking prey silhouetted against the surface. Great whites possess rows of serrated, triangular teeth engineered to shear through flesh and blubber in a single pass. In cases of mistaken identity, where a shark strikes a human rather than its intended prey, the animal typically delivers a single exploratory bite and disengages upon encountering an unfamiliar body composition. However, a single bite from a mature great white can sever major arteries and cause massive tissue damage. Even brief contact can prove fatal within minutes. The strike came from directly below. The shark hit Viljoen with enough force to jolt her partially upward in the water, its jaws clamping around her left thigh and hip in a single explosive motion before releasing almost immediately. The entire contact lasted less than 2 seconds. The shark did not return. It disappeared into the dark water as quickly as it had come, a single devastating bite after which the shark disengaged, having determined it was not typical prey. But the damage was catastrophic. The bite had severed major arteries in the upper leg and sheared through deep muscle tissue across her thigh and hip. Blood poured into the water at a rate unlikely to be survivable without immediate advanced care. The other swimmers scrambled toward the boat as the water around Viljoen darkened. Grayling and a deckhand pulled her aboard within roughly a minute or 2 of the strike, but she had already lost consciousness. Efforts to control the bleeding proved futile. Viljoen was unresponsive before the vessel reached the harbor and was pronounced dead shortly after arrival at the nearest medical facility. The investigation found that Grayling had been operating without proper permits and placing swimmers directly in the water near an active seal colony for over a year. The combination of peak predator season, absence of caging, and reduced visibility had created conditions strongly associated with mistaken identity strikes. Grayling's operating license was permanently revoked, and he faced regulatory penalties and potential criminal liability. It was September 7th, 2015, the Texas Gulf Coast. September on that stretch of beach sits at the back end of summer. The crowds have thinned, the water is still warm, and the seasonal fish runs draw activity close to shore. In the late afternoon, the light flattens early, and the surf line becomes harder to read against the glare. County closure signs posted along beach access points don't always register the way they should, especially to someone who has already decided the water looks manageable. Eddie Rayner was 22 and had spent the past 3 years competing in freediving events along the Gulf Coast. He had placed in regional competitions and trained regularly with a small private group from a coastal club that met twice a week during the season. He kept track of his dives, followed his depth records closely, and had likely spent more time in the open Gulf than most people his age would in a lifetime of casual swimming. He wasn't new to open water, and he didn't underestimate what it demanded. He had reached a point where experience started to feel like control, but the ocean doesn't really reward that kind of thinking. In open water with large predators during an active feeding event, the difference between them is the only thing that matters. County workers had posted posted red closure signs along a half-mile stretch of Gulf Beach that afternoon, following multiple reports of large tiger sharks feeding unusually close to shore during a seasonal fish run that had pushed baitfish into the shallows in unusually high concentrations. The fish run had been building for 2 days. The shark activity had been reported by several fishing boats working the area that morning, and the county had moved quickly. Signs posted, patrol vehicles parked at the access points, the closure announced through local emergency alerts before midday. The signs were visible from the access road. The patrol vehicles were still there when Eddie arrived. He read the closures, assessed the surface conditions, and entered the restricted surf alone just before dusk, carrying fins and a dive mask. He had told 2 friends waiting on the beach he would be back in 20 minutes. He wasn't confused about what the signs meant. He processed the information correctly: large sharks, active feeding, official closure, and concluded that 3 years of competitive freediving placed him in a different category than whoever the signs were written for. That reasoning was not irrational given his experience level. It was simply wrong about the one variable that determined the outcome. Tiger sharks are opportunistic predators that will strike at nearly any available target during feeding conditions. Adults regularly exceed 14 feet in length and 1,400 pounds, making them the second largest predatory shark species in coastal water. They are highly active during low light hours and move through shallow water readily during bait fish concentrations, following the fish column into depths that feel too shallow for an animal that size until they are already there. What makes them specifically hazardous in those conditions is not behavioral aggression in the conventional sense. It is indifference. Tiger sharks are not selective. They do not assess experience level or intent. A competitive freediver moving through the same water column as a struggling bait fish at dusk in low light above an active feeding concentration does not present a different signal. The shark responds to what is in the water, not to what it brought with it. About 120 feet from shore, the 2 friends on the beach heard violent splashing before the surface went still. They entered the surf and reached him briefly before a second strike pulled him farther into darker water. The second strike is consistent with documented tiger shark behavior during feeding events. They do not disengage after initial contact when stimulus remains present in the water. Rescue crews responded within the hour. Partial remains were recovered the following morning nearly 2 miles down the coastline. He had told his friends he would be back in 20 minutes. That is not the statement of someone who believed he was entering a genuinely dangerous situation. The beach closure, the patrol vehicles, the fish run, the fading light. He saw all of it and still came to a different conclusion. In his mind, experience was enough to manage the risk, but the tiger shark moving through that water at dusk wasn't part of that calculation at all. It had no idea who he was or how experienced he might have been. It was simply there first. It was January 12, 2018. The air over South Africa's eastern cape was heavy before a summer storm. A boat sat near the Mzimvubu River mouth off Port St. John's, a known bull shark hotspot. Murky, nutrient-rich water drew bait fish and predators. It was shallow near the cage, dropping sharply just yards away. Precy Boyd was 29 years old, a tourist from the Philippines on a backpacking trip through South Africa. She'd signed up for a shallow water cage experience, a newer type of tour being marketed as a less intense, safer alternative to the deepwater great white dives. The cage was smaller, the setup was simpler, and the whole operation was designed to feel more accessible. Unlike traditional fully enclosed cages, this one used a minimalist eco-design with a partially open bottom and wider lower rail gaps, allowing divers to stand with their fins slightly below the frame in the shallow water. Precy, according to friends she was traveling with, had specifically chosen this operator because she believed the shallow placement of the cage significantly reduced the risk. I get why she picked that operator. I probably would have thought the same thing. Shallow water, smaller cage, it sounds safer on paper. But hearing it now, I realize how much that belief can lull you into a false sense of security. The briefing that morning had been brief. The crew pointed out the drop-off, mentioned the low visibility, and gave the standard instructions about keeping limbs inside the cage. They did not emphasize how the open bottom design and lower rail spacing could allow a diver's legs or fins to drift just outside the protective frame if positioning wasn't controlled. Precy entered the water with 2 other divers, carrying her phone in a waterproof pouch to film a close-up selfie. She positioned herself near the outer bars, leaning against the cage wall to get a stable shot in the gentle current, her fins and lower legs subtly dipping below the cage's bottom edge with each shift of the water. Bull sharks are arguably the most adaptable and aggressive large predators on the planet. They can thrive in both salt and fresh water, are notoriously territorial, and are responsible for a huge percentage of coastal shark attacks worldwide. They typically grow to between 7 and 11 feet, but they are powerfully built, with a stocky frame and a bite force that, pound for pound, exceeds that of a great white. A bull shark, estimated at around 8 feet long, had moved into the area from the deeper channel, drawn by the scent and vibration of the cage and the people inside it. It approached low and slow, completely unseen in the murky water. As Prissy leaned outward to frame her selfie, her legs, no longer fully shielded by the cage due to the open bottom gap, hung just below the lower rails. The shark surged upward from beneath the cage and struck. The bite clamped onto her right thigh first, crushing and severing the femoral artery in a single catastrophic impact. As the shark thrashed, its head and body twisting violently, its teeth raked across her other leg, mangling it in the motion rather than cleanly biting both at once. The force of the hit drove her backward into the cage bars. The shark released almost immediately and vanished back into the murk before anyone else fully understood what had happened. Prissy collapsed inward, her body going limp as blood poured from the wounds, turning the water inside the cage dark in seconds. The divers beside her recoiled, pressed against the bars, shouting through their regulators as the current pulled the spreading cloud through the cage. The crew above reacted to the sudden bloom of blood in the water and began hauling the cage up, but the extraction took several crucial moments as they fought to stabilize it against the river's outflow current. By the time they got her onto the boat, the blood loss was too massive to control. She lost consciousness on the deck and was pronounced dead before they reached the shore. Investigators later confirmed that the proximity of the cage to the deepwater drop-off, combined with the extremely poor visibility, created a high-risk scenario that the divers weren't adequately warned about. For me personally, the lesson I get from Prissy's story is, if something feels safe only because it looks simpler or less intimidating, I need to ask myself, is it actually safer or just marketed that way? It was January 28th, 2013, off the coast of the Azores, a remote Portuguese archipelago about 900 miles west of mainland Europe. The water felt deep, open, and indifferent, with long, slow swells rolling beneath a clear sky and manageable wind. On paper, it was a good day to be out. Riven Callis Thorne, 42, had been running charter fishing trips out of a small private operation in the Azores for over a decade. No large outfit, no corporate backing, just a vessel, a reputation built through word of mouth, and a client list that kept returning. He was known for running trips that felt personal. He handled lines himself, stayed close to the action, and encouraged clients to engage directly with the catch. To me, that hands-on approach was probably exactly why people booked with him. It was also the thing that put him closest to the water when it mattered most. The Azores sits within a pelagic corridor, open ocean habitat where large migratory species move through regularly. Bluefin tuna, wahoo, and billfish were common targets. So were the predators that followed them. Encounters with large pelagic species near the vessel weren't unusual, and most experienced operators had protocols for managing active catches near the gunnel. Riven had been doing this long enough that those protocols had become second nature, and I think that's exactly where the danger hid. Not in ignorance, but in the kind of comfort that makes you stop running through the checklist. That morning, the group had been working a productive stretch of water for several hours. Multiple fish had been brought alongside without incident. The clients were engaged, the mood was relaxed, and the rhythm of the trip had settled into something familiar. Then, a large fish struck one of the lines and the dynamic shifted. The fish ran hard before tiring, and by the time it was being worked toward the surface, it was still fighting. At the gunnel, it thrashed violently, the kind of erratic, desperate movement a hooked fish produces when it has nowhere left to go. Riven moved in to manage the line manually, leaning over the side to control the retrieve. What was also happening beneath the surface, unnoticed, was a response to that same struggling fish. Short-fin mako sharks are among the fastest fish in the ocean, capable of extremely rapid bursts of speed. They are highly attuned to the erratic movement and low-frequency vibrations produced by distressed prey, signals that travel through open water and draw them in from significant distance. A hooked fish thrashing at the surface is, in almost every measurable way, an ideal stimulus. Makos don't approach cautiously. When they commit to a feeding response, they move directly and without hesitation. The shark struck the hooked fish at the surface. In the confusion of that contact and the violent thrashing that followed, the water around the gunnel became immediately chaotic. Riven was leaning over the side, managing the line, directly within range of that disturbance when it happened. The contact with him occurred not as a targeted strike, but within the chaos of the surface thrash, position and timing intersecting in the worst possible way. By the time the situation changed, he was already inside it. The injuries were severe. The vessel was offshore, well beyond the range of rapid emergency response, and onboard medical capability was limited to basic first aid supplies. The crew pulled him back onto the deck immediately and worked to control the bleeding. A distress call was made. Despite continued attempts to manage the bleeding, he succumbed before any assistance could reach them. Not the attack itself, but the distance. The ocean doesn't care how far you are from help. The clients on board were physically unharmed. The vessel returned to port under the crew's management. Local maritime authorities documented the incident and conducted a standard review. One of the clients had been recording video on a personal device during the trip and reportedly captured portions of the incident. The footage was surrendered to maritime authorities during the review process and was never released publicly, retained as part of the official documentation. The charter operation closed in the months that followed, not by official order, but because there was no one left to run it. For me, the hardest part about this story is that Riven likely believed he was doing exactly what he had always done. He had spent over a decade reading that ocean well enough to keep clients safe and coming back, and experience slowly convinced him the variables would remain manageable. It was July 21, 2020, near South Bimini, Bahamas. The evening tide was rising, pushing water across a shallow sandbar right next to a deep drop-off. Tourists were enjoying the calm sunset, completely unaware that beneath the surface, the tide was turning the area into a hunting ground for bait fish and predators. That evening, 22-year-old Evan Pitt stood ankle-deep on a sandbar off Bimini while the last light of the day turned the water gold. A few boats drifted nearby. Tourists snapped photos from the shallows, and from a distance it looked like one of those places that seems almost too perfect to be dangerous. Back home in Fort Pierce, Florida, Evan worked long hours as a dockhand unloading fishing boats and hauling equipment. The work was tough, but it paid the bills. What he really wanted was to build something online. For nearly 2 years, he'd been posting videos whenever he could, nothing outrageous. Mostly fishing trips, travel clips, and small challenges with friends. But like a lot of creators, he kept waiting for that one video that might finally get noticed. During a weekend trip to the Bahamas with his roommate Nolan, Evan saw an opportunity. The sandbar offered incredible views, especially near sunset when the water became almost crystal clear. His plan was simple: film himself walking across the exposed flats while the sun dropped toward the horizon. And honestly, that's what makes this story unsettling to me. There wasn't some crazy stunt involved. Plenty of people would have looked at the same situation and thought it seemed perfectly reasonable. The problem was where the sandbar sat. Just beyond the shallow flats was a deep tidal channel, the kind of place local boat operators generally knew to be cautious around near sunset. Bait fish were actively breaking the surface. Later, investigators learned that at least one nearby operator had been warning visitors about bull shark activity along the drop-off in the days prior, though whether Evan heard or heeded those warnings is unclear. Bull sharks are especially dangerous because they don't always stay in deep water. Adults commonly grow between 7 and 10 feet long and regularly move into shallow coastal areas where people swim and wade. They're aggressive, opportunistic predators and are responsible for a significant number of serious shark attacks worldwide. As the evening went on, the tide slowly crept higher across the flats. Water that had been around his ankles earlier was now reaching his knees in some places. Nolan continued recording while Evan moved farther from shore, trying different camera angles and retaking shots whenever something didn't look right. Then Nolan noticed something. A large shadow moved along the edge of the channel. It didn't rush toward them. It didn't thrash the surface. It simply cruised through deeper water before disappearing again. And this is the part where I would have been done. The second I see a shadow the size of a kayak moving beneath me, the video is over. But Evan stayed. A few minutes later, the water beside him exploded. Witnesses later described seeing a large shark surge out of deeper water and strike him with tremendous force. The impact spun him sideways and knocked him off balance. His scream carried across the flats, drawing the attention of people on nearby boats. When Evan tried to stand, his right leg gave out. The shark had bitten high into his thigh, severing major blood vessels. Blood quickly spread through the water as Nolan rushed to him, yelling for help. Nearby boaters immediately headed toward the sandbar and helped pull Evan from the shallows. What many people don't realize is that a single shark bite can be fatal if it hits the wrong place. Severe damage to a major artery can cause a person to bleed out within minutes. Evan was rushed back to shore, where emergency crews were waiting, but the blood loss was too severe. He was pronounced dead shortly afterward from injuries to major vessels in his upper thigh. Clips recorded during the incident were not released to the public and were kept for further investigation. It was September 8, 2018, at a small working harbor on the eastern side of Maui, Hawaii, used mainly by local fishing boats, where the late-day sun dropped low and the water near the docks had turned a dull, greasy gray. The air smelled of salt and fish, and a slick of blood and scraps drifted out from where the boats had spent the afternoon cleaning their catch. Zephyr Quillen, 34, was a freelance videographer who had recently shifted toward adventure content for social media. He was comfortable in the ocean and had logged plenty of hours filming surf and coastline, but he had almost no real experience around large predatory sharks. What drove him, by most accounts, was the constant search for footage that looked more dangerous than what other creators were posting. That detail explains a lot. When looking fearless becomes the goal, reckless decisions often follow. While working in Hawaii, Zephyr heard about this harbor from people who described it as a place where fishermen gutted and cleaned large fish at the end of every day, then dumped the scraps into the surrounding water. The workers there regularly reported tiger sharks drifting in to investigate, drawn by the steady supply of remains. Faded warning signs near the docks discouraged anyone from swimming in the area. To Zephyr, that reputation did not read as a warning. It read as a guarantee. The one place where he could film a large shark up close without chartering a boat or paying for a guided dive. He arrived late in the afternoon, after several boats had already cleaned their catch and the water was thick with scent and floating scraps. Harbor workers told him plainly that sharks were often pulled in by the smell of fish remains and that getting in the water was a bad idea. One of the dock workers stepped in front of him and told him directly that he was not allowed in the water and that the area was off limits to swimmers. Zephyr waited until the man moved on to other work, then quietly dropped in from the far side of the dock, staying near the pilings where the scraps were heaviest. That decision changed everything. He didn't accidentally find danger. He went right into it, despite the warnings, and passed an attempt to physically stop him. Tiger sharks are among the largest and most dangerous predators in Hawaiian waters, capable of reaching lengths well over 12 feet and weighing hundreds of pounds. Unlike many other shark species, they are opportunistic hunters that investigate a wide range of potential prey, relying on patience and close inspection before committing to an attack. In clear water, they are often seen long before they become a threat. In murky conditions, a swimmer may not see them at all until they are already within striking distance. When a large tiger shark drifted in and began circling, Zephyr kept recording instead of climbing out. The animal made a slow first pass, then a second, tightening its loop with each turn. That circling behavior is one of the clearest warning signs a large shark can give, an indication that it is assessing something in the water rather than simply passing through. The strike, when it came, was not a quick bite and release. The shark came up from below and clamped onto his upper thigh and hip, causing catastrophic blood loss as it dragged him beneath the surface, and the sheer size of the animal made any resistance meaningless. A mature tiger shark can generate tremendous bite force, and injuries to the upper leg are especially dangerous because of the major blood vessels that run through the area. In deep water, with no immediate help and no way to control the bleeding, even a survivable bite can become fatal within minutes. By the time the people on shore understood what was happening, the encounter was already over. Emergency services were contacted immediately, and a Coast Guard vessel was on scene within the hour. What followed was a prolonged search that extended into the following days. Remains and personal effects were eventually recovered in the area, though not intact, which is consistent with how these incidents typically resolve, and which made formal identification a slow process. The attack itself lasted well under a minute. His action camera was never recovered. In the aftermath, local officials cited the harbor as a clear example of why swimming near fish cleaning operations is so dangerous, and the warning signs were reinforced. Beyond that, little changed, because the people who worked there had understood the risk all along. Looking back, this one is hard to call anything other than self-inflicted. Zephyr was warned by the very people who knew the water best. He saw the scraps and the scent slick for himself, and he chose to stay in for a shot. He did not misjudge a calm-looking sea. He deliberately entered a feeding ground. It was September 21st, 2017, and the Red Sea shimmered under a cloudless sky off the coast of southern Egypt. A local dive operation ran daily boat excursions to offshore reef sites, where drift dives along deep walls offered encounters with pelagic species that rarely appeared closer to shore. Velizar Radev was a 29-year-old dive instructor from Plovdiv, Bulgaria, who had relocated to Egypt 2 years earlier. Radev held advanced certifications and had logged over 2,000 dives across the Mediterranean, Red Sea, and Southeast Asia. He served as a senior guide responsible for leading open water excursions and managing client safety during drift dives along the deeper reef systems. The afternoon excursion carried Radev and 4 clients to a reef site approximately 8 miles offshore. The dive boat, captained by Ashraf Gabala, 43, would drop the group at the northern end of a wall and collect them at a designated exit point roughly half a mile south. The plan was routine. The dive proceeded normally for approximately 35 minutes before the group ascended at the exit point. Radev had deployed a delayed surface marker buoy during ascent, but the current and the boat's engine failure had carried the vessel out of position. The group surfaced into open water with no vessel in sight and over 200 feet of blue water beneath them. A commercial fishing vessel had been operating nearby that morning, and traces of bait and fish waste drifted through the area. Radev gathered the group at the surface and deployed an inflatable signal marker. He instructed the clients to stay close together in a tight formation, fins inward, minimizing their profile. The group floated in the open ocean and waited. Oceanic white-tip sharks are among the most dangerous open-water predators encountered by humans, associated with several historical open-water incidents involving survivors adrift in tropical oceans. Adults reach lengths of 10 to 13 feet and weights approaching 370 pounds. Unlike reef-associated species that strike quickly and retreat, oceanic white-tips are persistent, methodical investigators. They approach slowly, circling at distance before closing gradually, investigating potential targets with gentle bumps before escalating to exploratory bites. Their broad, rounded, first dorsal fin and long white-tipped pectoral fins make them unmistakable. White-tips are solitary and bold, often not deterred by human presence, and they are drawn to irregular surface activity, splashing, and the scent of blood or organic material in the water. Attacks typically follow a prolonged investigation period that can persist for extended periods. The first sign appeared within 20 minutes of the group surfacing. Radev spotted the distinctive white-tipped dorsal fin circling at a distance of roughly 50 yards. The shark was large, an estimated 10 feet, moving in slow, wide arcs. Radev maintained the tight formation and instructed the clients to keep still, avoid splashing, and remain facing the animal. Over the following 40 minutes, the shark tightened its circles steadily, from 50 yards to 30, then 15. It made several close passes, its pectoral fins nearly brushing the diver's fins. On at least 2 occasions, it bumped a client's leg with its snout. Radev maintained eye contact with the animal and, when it came too close, attempted occasional defensive contact against its snout. In some instances, it veered away briefly before resuming its orbit. Approaching an hour in the water, the boat appeared on the horizon. Gabala had repaired the engine and was approaching at speed. As the group began swimming toward the vessel, the tight formation broke apart. Radev, who had been positioning himself between the shark and the clients throughout, found himself several yards behind as the others reached the swim platform. The shark, which had been circling at distance during the boat's approach, moved in decisively. It struck Radev from behind as he turned toward the swim platform, its jaws closing around his lower leg just below the knee. The serrated teeth sheared through muscle and severed major arteries in the lower leg. Radev was briefly pulled downward before resurfacing. Gabala and a deckhand dragged him onto the platform. Within seconds, but severe arterial bleeding was difficult to control with onboard first aid. Radev lost consciousness during the high-speed return to port. He was pronounced dead before the vessel reached the harbor. The investigation noted the engine failure as a major contributing factor that placed the group in open water without boat support, compounded by residual fishing activity nearby that may have contributed to attracting the oceanic white-tip into the area. It was May 18, 2016, the Gulf Coast of Florida. People who know that stretch of coastline know May specifically, the last few weeks before the heat stops being pleasant and starts being something you have to manage. The water is shallow and warm close to shore. The sandbars visible from the road on a clear afternoon. The beach access roads along that section of the Panhandle fill up fast when something draws a crowd. Cars half on the grass, doors left open, people who pull over without quite deciding to. Dana Mercer was 34, a substitute teacher from southern Georgia who had driven down through the Panhandle for a long weekend alone. She had 2 kids at home and a school calendar that didn't leave much space for spontaneous decisions. The drive had been a chance to move without a plan, stopping at roadside stands, doubling back on county routes, and she had been doing exactly that when she noticed vehicles pulled over along a beach access road and a cluster of people gathered at the waterline. She had no background around large predators. What she had was the same thing most people in that crowd had: curiosity and a working assumption that the situation was more controlled than it looked. What had drawn the crowd was a stranded juvenile great white shark, 11 feet long and estimated at roughly 700 pounds, trapped between a sandbar and the shoreline during low tide. It had been been thrashing in the shallows for close to 20 minutes by the time Dana arrived. The animal's gills were working visibly above the waterline, and its tail was still generating enough force to churn the sand around it into a pale, clouded suspension. Great white sharks along the Florida Panhandle in May are not the anomaly most people assume. They follow an established seasonal migration, moving south along the Atlantic seaboard in late autumn, entering Gulf waters through the Florida Straits in winter, and pushing north again through the Panhandle as temperatures climb into May. The corridor from Pensacola through Panama City sits where baitfish concentrations, migratory prey, and bottom structure converge. The animal in the shallows that afternoon was not behaving unusually. It was a large predator at the end of its return migration, pushed into shallow water by tidal conditions it had no way to anticipate. Several local fishermen were already at the waterline when the crowd started gathering, and they hadn't stopped warning people since. The shark was alive, still oriented toward open water, still snapping at movement nearby, still very much an animal that had not run out of options. The fishermen weren't being cautious. They were being accurate. Great white sharks in stranded conditions enter a stress-elevated state that makes them significantly more reactive than their exhaustion might suggest. A juvenile in the 500-pound range can generate over 4,000 pounds of bite pressure and respond to nearby contact with full lateral force, regardless of how long it has been out of deeper water. The exhaustion is real, but the instinct underneath it remains intact. What looks like a dying animal from 30 feet away is still, at close range, everything it was in open water. Dana picked up a broken branch from the rack line and walked to within arm's reach of the animal, standing ankle-deep in the water beside its head. She used the branch to probe near the shark's gill area, while several people filmed from farther up the beach. The fisherman called out again. The crowd had gone quieter in the way crowds do when something is about to happen and nobody knows how to stop it. The shark twisted, not gradually, not with any buildup that gave the people watching time to process what was coming, but with the complete sudden lateral force of an animal that still had everything available to it. The movement threw it partially sideways and knocked Dana off her feet, putting her left arm and shoulder directly within range. The shark seized her and pulled her several feet into deeper water as the tide came back in. Beachgoers managed to pull her back using a rope attached to a nearby cooler. The time between the branch making contact and Dana being in the water was later estimated at under 3 seconds. The bite severed the brachial artery in her upper left arm. Bystanders applied direct compression while one of the fishermen used his belt as a tourniquet above the wound. EMS reached the scene within 12 minutes and continued resuscitation efforts during transport. She went into cardiac arrest in the ambulance and was pronounced dead on arrival at the Regional Trauma Center. What stays with this case is that the information was complete before Dana took a single step toward that animal. There was nothing hidden, nothing she could have misread. A live, stranded predator. A crowd of people all giving the same warning. The animal's own visible agitation is clear from a safe distance. She walked through all of it anyway, and the shark responded the only way a stranded great white in a stress-elevated state was ever going to respond to direct contact at close range. It was October 2nd, 2016, and the early morning fog hanging over the Pacific was just beginning to thin near Guadalupe Island, nearly 150 miles off the coast of Baja California. The water below looked dark and endless, broken only by the slow rolling wake of the dive boat. Guadalupe had built a reputation as one of the best places on Earth to see great white sharks up close, which was exactly why Colton Riggs had spent almost 4 months saving for the trip. Colton was 27 years old, from Reno, Nevada, and worked long shifts as a warehouse mechanic when he wasn't filming content for his growing social media pages. Wildlife clips, abandoned buildings, cliff dives, anything risky enough to grab attention. He wasn't famous, but he had enough followers to believe one truly viral photo could change his life. He had been thinking about it for weeks before the trip even began. A selfie with a great white shark filling the frame behind him. No bars, no cage, just him and the ocean's apex predator in a single image that nobody could scroll past. I can see by Colton's attitude that he is going to do everything just to make his viewers happy, even if it means doing risky things. The operator running the expedition was fully licensed and widely respected. Before the cages touched the water, the crew walked everyone through a thorough safety briefing. Stay inside the cage. Keep all limbs behind the bars. Do not extend cameras outside under any circumstance. The latch key for each cage was kept on the equipment table near the stern, handled only by crew members. Colton nodded through the briefing while adjusting his 2 cameras, one mounted safely to the bars, the other a wide-angle handheld, the kind built for selfies, with a flip screen so you could frame yourself without guessing. But he was only half listening. He had already spotted the cage latch key on the equipment table, and somewhere between the briefing and the moment the crew turned away, he palmed it quietly into his wetsuit pocket. The selfie he had been imagining needed open water. The cage door was the only thing standing between him and it. The surface cage was lowered into the water with Colton inside alone. The visibility that morning stretched nearly 100 feet below him, clear enough to see shapes moving deep before they reached the bait line. Great white sharks are built for explosive vertical attacks. Large females near Guadalupe regularly exceed 15 feet and can weigh over 2,000 pounds, capable of launching upward at terrifying speed in a single committed burst. The first shark arrived within minutes, a female estimated around 14 feet long. She circled beneath the cage while the crew worked the bait line. Colton watched her move and felt the shot forming in his mind. He could already picture the composition. Himself in the foreground, the shark rising massive behind him, the deep blue of the Pacific dropping away beneath them both. No bars cutting across the frame. No steel. Just the image. Then the shark disappeared below the cage. That should have been the warning. Instead, Colton pulled out the stolen latchkey and worked it into the cage lock. The door swung open. He turned his back to the open water, raised the wide-angle camera toward his own face, and tilted it to capture the ocean behind him. He was framing his selfie. Below him, the shark was already accelerating upward. The breach happened so fast that several people on deck didn't process what they'd seen until after the water exploded white around the cage. The shark struck upward through the open door from behind and clamped across Colton's shoulder and upper arm in a single violent snap, the force instantly fracturing bone before the animal twisted away. The damage was catastrophic. The bite severed the brachial artery near the shoulder joint. Blood clouded the water within seconds. The crew hauled the cage upward immediately, but severe arterial bleeding in open water gives almost no margin for recovery. By the time they pulled Colton onto the deck, he was already losing consciousness. He was pronounced dead before reaching shore. Investigators reviewed footage from the mounted cage camera. The video showed the cage door swinging open from the inside, Colton turning his back to the water, and the camera raised toward his own face in the final seconds. Colton Riggs had not acted on impulse. He had planned it from the moment he saw that key on the table. He came to Guadalupe for one image. He made his choice on land, carried it into the water, and the last thing he ever framed was his own face. I actually went cage diving once, and even with the bars between me and the water, my heart was pounding. Watching Colton step out makes me realize how different the mindset is when you're chasing a viral shot. It was July 8, 2013, near Monterey Bay, California. The morning arrived cold and gray beneath a heavy marine layer, and the kelp beds shifted beneath the surface with the swell. Visibility offshore changed constantly as moving currents pushed darker water through the thick patches of kelp. That summer, water temperatures along the California coastline had been lower than usual. Seal activity had increased near several coastal feeding areas, and reports of juvenile and subadult great white shark sightings closer to shore had become more common. Experienced divers were paying attention. Most had already started adjusting where and how they entered the water. Some avoided certain kelp beds entirely during low-visibility mornings. Others stopped carrying fish directly attached to their bodies after several close encounters had circulated through local diving communities. Cy Hale, 27, did not. Cy worked as a commercial spearfisherman and had spent years diving the Monterey coastline. People who knew him described him as highly capable underwater, calm in rough conditions, and extremely confident in his own judgment. But honestly, there's a specific kind of danger that comes from doing risky things successfully for too long. Eventually, surviving starts feeling like proof that the warnings don't apply to you anymore. Cy had developed a reputation for ignoring safety recommendations he considered overly cautious. One habit stood out in particular. He frequently dove alone in areas where most experienced spearfishers strongly preferred working in pairs. He also dismissed most shark concerns, not because he thought sharks didn't exist, but because he believed the actual risk was exaggerated. And after years of successful solo dives, he had enough confidence behind him to trust his own judgment over everyone else's. In the weeks leading up to July 8th, several divers had discussed increased shark sightings along sections of the Monterey coast. A local fisherman had even warned Cy days earlier after spotting large shadows moving through one of the kelp channels near sunrise. Cy entered the water anyway. That morning, he carried several recently speared fish attached directly to a waist stringer clipped beside his body. Among experienced spearfishers, that practice is widely discouraged in areas with known shark activity because bleeding fish create a concentrated scent trail directly connected to the diver. Personally, this is what makes the situation feel grounded. Nothing Sai did was unusual on its own. Solo diving, waist stringers, dense kelp. Divers do those things all the time. It's when they combine under the wrong conditions that situations turn dangerous. The kelp beds Sai moved through that morning were thick enough that visibility constantly shifted, depending on current movement and light filtering through the surface. At times, divers could only see a few feet ahead before the water darkened again between the kelp stalks. A nearby fishing crew had noticed unusually heavy seal activity along the outer kelp line earlier that morning. Several seals had been moving erratically before abruptly disappearing deeper offshore. Sai continued diving farther into the kelp. Large sharks are known to investigate silhouettes, splashing, and irregular movement patterns in low-visibility water, especially in areas containing seals or struggling fish. At some point later that morning, the nearby fishing crew heard sudden, violent splashing deeper within the kelp beds. When they looked toward the disturbance, they caught brief, unclear glimpses of a large shape thrashing near Sai's float line before it disappeared beneath the surface. By the time they maneuvered through the kelp toward the area, the water had already gone quiet. Sai's float drifted partially tangled in the kelp, while a dark plume spread slowly through the current beneath it. One member of the crew later reported seeing torn sections of wetsuit material caught along the line, though visibility made it difficult to determine exactly what had happened. Search crews arrived later that afternoon and began combing the kelp beds, while Coast Guard aircraft searched farther offshore. Divers involved in the search described visibility conditions as extremely poor beneath the surface, especially deeper inside the kelp fields. Investigators later concluded the incident was consistent with predatory investigation behavior in low visibility conditions, likely influenced by the presence of attached fish and nearby seal activity. Search teams eventually recovered damaged dive equipment, sections of Sai's wetsuit, his detached float line, and scattered fishing gear within the kelp beds. Limited remains were recovered. The incident intensified ongoing debate among California spearfishers regarding solo diving practices and the use of waist stringers in areas with documented shark activity. Several local diving groups began encouraging newer divers to use floating catch bags positioned farther from the body instead. For me, the hardest part about this story is that Sai probably entered the water believing experience would compensate for the danger around him. But experience doesn't change how predators interpret movement, scent, or silhouettes underwater. It was February 9th, 2016, off the coast of Gansbai, in South Africa's Western Cape. The channel running between Dyer Island and Geyser Rock, known locally as Shark Alley, was at peak seasonal activity. Cage diving operators in the area had been logging multiple large great whites nearly every day for the previous 2 weeks, and conditions that morning were consistent with that pattern. 2 sharks had already been sighted near the vessel before passengers had finished suiting up. Dalton Ruykers, 31, was a personal fitness trainer based in Cape Town. Marika Fosser, 27, was his girlfriend of 2 years, a retail manager from Stellenbosch who had grown up near the coast. 3 weeks before the incident, according to digital records recovered by investigators, messages and call logs spanning several months, Dalton had discovered that Marique had been involved with another man and had been planning to end the relationship. Friends of Dalton's, interviewed during the investigation, stated he had been visibly enraged in the days following the discovery. One contact recalled him describing, in a late-night phone call, a plan to take Marieke somewhere she couldn't simply walk away from. At the time, it was taken as the kind of thing someone says in anger. It was not. The booking for the shark diving excursion was made in Dalton's name 6 days after that conversation. The trip was presented to Marieke as a reconciliation gesture. She had always wanted to cage dive with great whites. She accepted. The operation they booked was well reviewed and had run hundreds of similar excursions without incident. Crew briefed all passengers before entry. Remain calm, stay within the cage structure, keep all extremities inside the bars at all times. The sharks that morning had been circling the surface intermittently, drawn by the chum line the crew had been running since early morning. 2 animals had been confirmed near the vessel before the first group entered the water. Marieke was near the stern platform in her wetsuit, preparing for cage entry. Dalton was directly behind her. What happened at that stern platform was reconstructed through crew statements collected during the investigation. Dalton pushed her, not toward the cage, but off the platform, into open water, entirely outside the cage structure. The crew saw it happening. They were already moving before she hit the water. Great white sharks are among the most powerful predatory fish on Earth, commonly exceeding 15 feet and over 2,000 pounds in South African waters. They are ambush predators built for speed from below, capable of striking with enough force to cause catastrophic blood loss from a single bite. In active hunting corridors near seal populations, with a chummed surface and confirmed shark activity already logged that morning, an unexpected human entry into open water creates a threat window that closes in seconds. There is no recovery time built into that equation. Marieke entered the water off the stern. A large great white struck her before the crew reached her position. Emergency response was initiated immediately. A Coast Guard medevac transported her to a hospital in Hermanus. Marika Vosser was pronounced dead that afternoon. Dalton Ruykers was detained at the harbor that evening. His phone was recovered at the scene. The message exchange was there. The booking timeline was there. Prosecutors did not treat it as a prank gone wrong. He was charged with murder. The vessel operator cooperated fully with investigators. The operations protocols were reviewed and found to have been correctly followed. The origin point of the incident, the investigation concluded, was a decision made weeks before anyone boarded that boat. I'll be direct about this one. Marika Vosser didn't make any call. Someone else decided what the risk was worth on her behalf and made a reservation to ensure it. That distinction matters more than anything else in this story. It was January 22, 2022, along a rugged stretch of the South African coast where the summer sun sat high over water that shifted between deep green and dark blue. The swell was moderate, the visibility decent near the surface, but fading into murk farther down, and the rocky shoreline behind him was empty, the nearest help a long way off. It was the kind of remote, productive spot that serious spearfishers seek out precisely because so few other people bother to reach it. Trevor Mattis, 41, was a construction supervisor and a dedicated recreational spearfisher. He had years of experience in the water and a deep confidence in his own ability, the sort built over countless dives that had gone exactly the way he expected. That confidence had a flip side, though. He tended to view safety recommendations as overcautious, the kind of advice meant for less experienced divers, and friends often joked that Trevor believed experience made him immune to mistakes. That's what stands out to me. Past success gave him confidence, but the habit he refused to change cost him his life. Trevor regularly traveled to coastal areas known for productive spearfishing, and this stretch of South African coast was among the richest, holding good numbers of fish, and, just as importantly, sitting squarely within waters where great white sharks are known to patrol. Experienced divers had warned him about this more than once. The specific concern was always the same, that staying in the water too long after a catch and carrying bleeding fish attached to his body was an invitation in a region full of large predators. Most serious spearfishers there towed their catch well behind them on a separate float line for exactly that reason. Trevor preferred clipping his fish directly to his belt instead, keeping them close and within easy reach. He had heard the warnings repeatedly. He simply did not change the way he dove, because nothing bad had ever happened before, and to him, that was proof enough that nothing would. That day, diving solo, Trevor had a productive session and successfully speared several large fish. The reasonable move, the one every warning had pointed toward, was to bring his catch in and get out of the water. Instead, he clipped the speared fish to the belt at his waist and kept hunting, the bleeding bodies trailing against him as he moved. Each fish leaked blood and fluids into the water, and each one twitched and struggled, sending out exactly the kind of vibrations and scent trail that travel a long way through the ocean. He had effectively turned himself into a source of everything a large predator hunts by, and he stayed out there, alone, long after he should have been back on the rocks. Great white sharks are among the largest predatory fish in the ocean, reaching lengths well over 15 feet and weights beyond 2,000 pounds, and the waters off South Africa hold one of the most concentrated populations on the planet. They possess an extraordinary sense for detecting blood, vibration, and the erratic movements of injured prey, often from considerable distances. A great white does not typically hunt people. It hunts seals, sea lions, and fish, and it tracks them by exactly the kind of disturbance a wounded fish gives off. A diver carrying a string of bleeding, struggling catch against his body, in practical terms, broadcasting the signal of injured prey. The danger was never that the shark wanted Trevor. The danger was that Trevor had attached himself to what the shark wanted. A great white drawn in by the struggling, bleeding fish closed in fast and struck at the catch clipped to his waist. There was little warning in open water like that, just the sudden arrival of an enormous animal homing in on the scent trail he had been dragging behind him. The shark was almost certainly targeting the fish rather than the man, but with the catch fixed to his belt, there was no separating the two. The bite tore through the fish and into his hip and upper thigh, severing the femoral artery and causing catastrophic blood loss in seconds. Alone in deep water, with no one nearby to pull him out or slow the bleeding, he had no chance. And the dive that should have ended 20 minutes earlier ended in the worst possible way. Other divers later found his abandoned float, a damaged belt rig, and blood in the water along that section of coast, and alerted authorities once it was clear he was was missing. A recovery effort followed. Marine experts who reviewed what happened pointed to a combination of avoidable choices rather than any unusual aggression from the animal: the solo diving, the bleeding catch clipped to his body, and the decision to stay in the water far longer than he needed to. The shark, they noted, had behaved exactly as a great white in those waters would be expected to behave, striking at what looked and smelled like wounded prey. The incident drew brief regional coverage and circulated through the local spearfishing community, where it became a sobering reminder that the warnings everyone had repeated to Trevor were not theoretical. This one stands out because the danger was not hidden in the slightest. Trevor knew the waters held great whites. He had been warned specifically about carrying bleeding fish, and he chose to do it anyway, on a solo dive, well past the point of any sensible exit. He did not misjudge an unfamiliar risk. He repeated a familiar one until it finally caught up with him. It was November 23, 2015, and the first storms of the wet season had swept across the coast of far north Queensland, dumping heavy rain across the river catchments that fed into the Coral Sea. The flooding had pushed walls of brown water downstream, swelling tidal creeks and river mouths with silt-heavy runoff that reduced underwater visibility to absolute zero. The floodwaters also carried something else. Bull sharks, already present in the river systems, became more active in the changing conditions. Warwick Cadzo was a 40-year-old commercial crab fisherman who had worked the tidal rivers and estuaries north of Cairns for over 15 years. He operated a small aluminum dinghy, running lines of baited crab pots along the river mouths and mangrove channels where mud crabs concentrated. The work required wading into shallow water to set and retrieve pots, a task Cadzo performed daily without giving it much thought. He had seen bull sharks in the rivers before, but regarded them as a known but normalized risk. His deckhand, Leith Margetts, 27, had worked with Cadzo for 2 seasons. That morning, they launched before dawn to check a line of 12 pots set along a mangrove-fringed river mouth. The water was the color of coffee, tannin-stained and heavy with silt from the recent rains. Visibility beneath the surface was zero. The tide was rising, pushing salt water upstream and creating the brackish mixing zone that bull sharks favor. Cadzo had noted the conditions, but pressed ahead. Lost days meant lost income. Bull sharks are widely considered the most dangerous shark species in shallow coastal and riverine environments. Adults reach lengths of 7 to 11 feet and weights between 200 and 500 pounds. Unlike most shark species, bull sharks tolerate fresh and brackish water, regularly entering rivers, estuaries, and tidal creeks to feed. They are aggressive and frequently implicated in attacks in murky, shallow water where visibility is poor and escape routes are limited. Their attack pattern in low visibility conditions is explosive and brief, a single high-speed strike aimed at disabling prey, followed by rapid disengagement or a secondary bite if resistance continues. Their serrated teeth and powerful jaws generate enough force to sever limbs and rupture major blood vessels in a single pass. Cadzo stepped off the dinghy into waist-deep water at the river mouth, wading toward the first pot marker approximately 20 feet from the boat. Margetts was sorting gear on the dinghy with his back partially turned. According to his later testimony, the first thing he registered was a violent eruption of water and a sound he described as a heavy, wet impact followed immediately by thrashing. He turned to see Cadzo struggling in churning brown water that was rapidly turning dark. The attack had come without any visible warning. No fin, no wake. No disturbance in the opaque water before the strike. Margetts froze for several seconds, unable to process what was happening. By the time he grabbed a gaff and moved toward the bow, the thrashing had already subsided. The water around Cadzo had gone still, except for a spreading stain of dark red drifting downstream with the current. The entire event, from initial strike to silence, had lasted only a few seconds before the water went still. Margetts pulled alongside and managed to drag Cadzo onto the dinghy. The damage to his lower left leg was catastrophic, with massive tissue loss and severed blood vessels consistent with a single devastating bite from a large bull shark. Cadzo was unresponsive with catastrophic blood loss. Margetts radioed for emergency assistance while attempting to control the bleeding, but the remote location meant paramedics did not reach the scene for over 40 minutes. Warwick Cadzo was pronounced dead on the riverbank. The investigation confirmed a bull shark attack in conditions that officials described as extremely high risk, noting that the post-flood water conditions had concentrated bull sharks in the same tidal zones where commercial fishermen routinely worked on foot. It was July 22, 2013, roughly 30 miles off the California coast, near the Farallon Islands. The seal colonies that draw sharks to the area are audible before they're visible, a constant, dense sound from the rocks that makes the biological reason for being in that water impossible to ignore. It is one of the most documented great white shark territories in the world. The briefings operators give before descent are not generic safety formalities. They are specific to this water, this season, and this animal. Nina Delgado was 38, a freelance nature photographer from Albuquerque, New Mexico, who had spent 15 years building a portfolio around access that required going places most people did not pursue professionally. She was not impulsive. Colleagues described someone who researched locations for weeks in advance, who understood every technical requirement before she arrived, and who accepted physical risk as a calculated professional cost. She had done cage dives before in less active water and understood the mechanics of the enclosure. She also made decisions about which rules applied to her work and which ones she believed could be adjusted without meaningfully changing the outcome. Those two things, genuine expertise and selective rule application, existed in her without apparent contradiction until they stopped being compatible. She had booked a discounted cage excursion with a small private crew running trips out toward the Farallon Islands, roughly 30 miles offshore during peak seal migration season, in water that produced some of the highest great white shark density on the Pacific coast. The operator had briefed all participants before descent. Both safety latches secured at all times, no extended contact with the cage bars, no bait devices inside the enclosure. The prohibition on bait devices had been added after earlier incidents involving sharks striking cage bars in response to handheld attractants. Nina had brought a small bait rig concealed inside her camera bag. She had planned to use it before the boat left the dock. Great white sharks in the waters around the Farallon Islands during seal season commonly exceed 15 feet in length and 2,000 pounds. During active feeding windows near seal colonies, they approach objects with an extended period of slow lateral investigation, circling at a distance, making gradual passes, before transitioning into high-velocity strikes that can close 20 feet in under a second. That investigative phase is what makes them appear manageable from inside a cage. The strike phase is what the cage is built for. The gap between those two behavioral states is narrow and does not announce itself in advance. Nina pushed the bait rig through the cage bars and unlatched one of the side doors to get a wider shooting angle. A 14-foot great white slammed into the open section with enough force to bend the door inward, knocking her partially outside the enclosure. The shark bit during the impact. The injury to her torso was severe enough that the crew could not control the bleeding before she lost consciousness. The cage was the thing that would have kept her alive if she had stayed inside it. What makes this case difficult is that Nina understood exactly what the cage was designed for and the kind of behavior it was meant to protect against. But little by little, she moved outside that protection. The bait rig, the extended arm, the unlatched door. None of those choices probably felt dangerous on their own. Together, they became one irreversible mistake. It was August 3, 2016, and the late summer heat was already pressing down over the Gulf waters off Freeport, Texas. From shore, the surface looked calm, but a few miles out, the current told a different story. Steady, insistent, pushing long swells beneath the hull. Visibility hovered around 25 to 30 feet, the water carrying that familiar green-blue haze that softened everything just beyond reach. Cage diving trips ran regularly in this stretch of water. Smaller operators worked farther offshore, relying less on rigid systems and more on experience. Bait lines were used to draw sharks in, typically positioned at a controlled distance from the cage. When handled properly, it created a narrow window, close enough for a clear view, far enough to keep the attraction point separate from the person inside. That separation was everything. James Finch was 31, working a physically demanding trade that kept him on long shifts most weeks. He was methodical by nature, not someone drawn to unnecessary risk. But sharks had been a constant interest since childhood. Years spent reading, watching, learning their behavior. He'd booked the trip months in advance, brought a small handheld camera with him. Nothing elaborate, just enough to document the experience. Before the dive, the crew delivered a standard briefing. Stay inside the cage, keep your body clear of the bars. Do not interfere with the bait line. The instructions were clear, routine, and James followed them without hesitation. I think the best part of James's story is that he actually listened. Many people ignore safety rules and treat them like background noise, but he took them seriously, and that changed everything. When his turn came, the cage was lowered, and he descended alone. At first, the water held only distance, faint movement at the edge of visibility, shapes that passed without committing. Then the pattern changed. Two larger forms emerged from below, tiger sharks, each estimated later between 10 and 12 feet. They didn't rush. They circled wide, deliberate arcs, testing the space before tightening their approach. Above, the crew worked the bait line. The current that morning was stronger than expected, pulling against the line in a steady lateral drift. Instead of correcting for it, shortening the tether or repositioning the angle, the line was left to move with the water. It didn't swing wildly. It shifted slowly, subtly, closing distance inch by inch. At the same time, slack formed. The bait dipped lower in the water column than intended, sinking closer to the depth of the cage rather than holding its offset position. No one adjusted it. No one pulled it back out. From inside, James tracked the movement, turning within the cage to keep both the sharks and the bait in view. He stayed within the bars, never reaching beyond them, never interfering. Everything he did stayed within the limits he'd been given. But of course, he did not forget to take a picture to capture this moment. Using his waterproof camera, he positioned himself in the camera where the shark can be seen in the background. While trying to take a picture, he did not notice that the space around him was changing. One of the sharks began to lock onto the bait. Its path straightened, movements becoming more direct with each pass. The drifting line, guided by current, continued to narrow the gap until the bait and the cage occupied nearly the same plane. The separation was gone. The shark's final approach came from below and slightly off-center, rising as it accelerated. Its focus was fixed entirely on the bait. With the line now within inches of the cage, the trajectory carried straight through the structure. The impact forced its snout and jaws between the bars. Inside, there was no time to react, no space to move. James was still positioned where he was taking a photo moments before, exactly where the bait had drifted toward. The bite was not exploratory. It was a full, committed strike. Its jaws closed on the bait, but the alignment placed his arm between metal and force. The pressure pinned it against the bars as the teeth cut through in a single motion. The shark recoiled almost immediately, pulling free, but the damage had already been done. It lasted only seconds. Above the surface, the crew reacted only after the water changed, after the strike had already happened. They began hauling the cage up immediately, but the delay between drift, recognition, and response left no margin. When they brought him onto the deck, the injury was catastrophic. Severe trauma to the arm, rapid and uncontrollable blood loss. A tourniquet was applied above the elbow, but the damage had progressed too far, too quickly. He lost consciousness before they were halfway back to shore. He was pronounced dead before they arrived. The investigation that followed focused on the operation itself. The findings pointed to inadequate bait line management, failure to compensate for current conditions, and unsafe proximity between the feeding zone and the cage. His camera was given back to his family, keeping it as a remembrance. A lot of you asked in the comments of my last video why I keep stressing operator responsibility. This case is exactly why. James followed every rule, but the crew's negligence erased the margin of safety. It was May 5th, 2026, and the morning off the coast of Gainesby came in with heavy swells and a flat gray sky that turned the water dark and opaque. Visibility was poor, and the sea state sat right at the edge of what most operators consider workable. Not unsafe on paper, but close enough that every margin matters. Rael Duvenhage, 34, a content creator from Oregon, had built his channel on controlled risk. Lately, growth has stalled. He wasn't failing, but he wasn't breaking through either. A live shark cage dive in rough water felt like the kind of escalation that could reset momentum. He arranged the shoot with a local operator willing to accommodate extra equipment. The cage hadn't been rebuilt, but it had been altered. Slightly widened bar spacing in a few sections for cleaner sightlines, plus added mounting points for cameras. The changes had been treated as cosmetic, not structural. Maintenance logs had already noted corrosion at several upper joints and weld points. Not critical yet, just flagged for repair. Deferred. 5 tourists entered despite a 4-person rough water limit. Priya Delaney, 31, a photographer from London. Luis Ortega, 28, a software engineer from Spain. Megan Pike, 33, a travel blogger from Florida. Carter Bell, 26, a former athlete with a habit of pushing past warnings. And Rael, who had secured lights, cameras, and battery packs along the frame. No one recalculated the load or how it would shift under motion. Honestly, I think that's where this locks in. Nothing dramatic, just a system quietly moving outside its design limits. As the cage was lowered, it didn't settle cleanly. It yawed with each swell. The support cable above cycling between slack and sudden tension. That repeated loading matters more than people think. It doesn't break things instantly. It weakens them, especially at compromised joints. Chum went into the water. At one point, bait was thrown closer than standard distance, tightening the movement around the cage. A large female great white shark, an apex predator built for explosive speed and power, cut through the waterline toward the bait. At nearly the same moment, a trough dropped the cage while the winch line snapped taut. The load shifted upward and sideways at once, forcing stress directly into the already corroded upper welds. One of those weld points failed. The cage didn't collapse. It racked, twisting out of the square. Inside, everyone was thrown hard into the bars. Priya was driven backward and upward at an angle, the back of her head striking a cross support with enough force to cause immediate loss of consciousness. Luis was forced downward as the cage dipped partially under the surface again. With the frame no longer square, load redistributed unevenly. Bolted connections along one modified section began to shear under torsion. The bars didn't bend cleanly. The joints gave way first, allowing a section to warp and flex. The gap wasn't open. It pulsed wider and narrower with each wave. Water surged in hard. Megan became pinned between angled supports. Rail tried to pull Luis upward, but the shifting cage kept forcing them down and off balance. Above them, the winch operator hesitated, reading the uneven tension as temporary swing rather than structural failure. The lift continued in short corrections, causing the cage to rise at an angle instead of evenly. One corner lifted higher while the compromised side dragged deeper, worsening the distortion with each adjustment. Carter was thrown sideways during another rotation. He braced instinctively, but his arm became trapped through the warped section as the cage rolled again. Visibility was near zero in the churn, timing, position, and entrapment lining up in the worst possible way. When the shark passed back through the same tight space created by bait and current, it intersected that position. Not a strike, not a decision. The result was immediate and catastrophic. I think this is the part people get wrong. They picture a single violent moment. It wasn't. It was cumulative stress, deferred maintenance, added weight, and unstable conditions, all resolving in seconds where nothing was corrected in time. It took additional time to stabilize the line and bring the cage up in controlled stages. By the time it fully cleared the surface, Priya remained unresponsive. Rael was recovered shortly after prolonged submersion during the delayed lift. CPR was started immediately on board, but neither could be revived. Priya was pronounced dead from blunt force trauma and drowning. Rael died following extended oxygen deprivation despite resuscitation efforts. Carter survived but lost his arm below the elbow. Megan and Luis were recovered alive, both with crush injuries and severe near-drowning complications. Fragments of the live stream spread briefly before being removed. The investigation later confirmed over-occupancy in rough conditions, deferred corrosion repairs at critical weld points, and baiting distance violations. The operator's license was permanently revoked. Honestly, I don't think the defining factor here was the shark. It was the quiet accumulation of decisions, each one small, each one explainable, until the system stopped having any capacity left to absorb failure. On September 23, 2021, the waters off Gansby were unusually calm. Fishing boats, sightseeing charters, and recreational vessels moved across the coastline beneath clear afternoon skies. The region had long been known for its population of large, great white sharks, and several sightings had already been reported by local operators that week. 29-year-old Noah Johnson had traveled to South Africa with his girlfriend, Elise, after a busy wedding season back home in Bristol. Noah ran a small videography business specializing in proposals, weddings, and travel content. Friends described him as creative, energetic, and constantly searching for ways to make each project more memorable than the last. During their trip, Noah booked a private charter near Gansby, hoping to capture dramatic footage of the coastline and marine wildlife. The area was famous for its rugged scenery, seals, and occasional sightings of great white sharks. Although shark attacks on people there were extremely rare, local crews still followed strict safety procedures around the water. That afternoon, the couple spent several hours filming along the coast. Conditions were calm, visibility was good, and the trip appeared to be going exactly as planned. As the boat drifted near a quiet stretch of coastline, Noah noticed that one of his action cameras had come loose from its mounting position near the stern. The camera remained attached by a short tether and was dragging just below the surface alongside the boat. The crew offered to retrieve it using using a boat hook once they reached calmer water, but Noah worried the equipment might break loose entirely or become damaged. Looking back, that's the moment that stands out to me. The camera wasn't irreplaceable. The trip was already a success, but sometimes people convince themselves they need to fix a small problem immediately. Noah stepped down onto the rear swim platform while the vessel was idling, moving quickly before the crew could redirect him. By the time a crew member turned to check the stern, Noah had already lowered himself into the water. Witnesses later said he recovered the camera almost immediately and turned back toward the boat. Then witnesses heard him yell. Several passengers later reported seeing a large splash followed by violent movement beneath the surface. Most initially assumed Noah had simply slipped or become tangled in the tether line. Then the water turned red. Investigators later concluded that a large great white shark likely approached from below and delivered a single bite to Noah's upper leg and pelvic region as he swam back toward the vessel. Unlike what many people imagine, the shark did not continue attacking. After the bite, it disappeared. But that single bite was devastating. Crew members immediately threw flotation devices into the water and pulled Noah back aboard within moments. He had lost consciousness by the time they got him on deck. Witnesses later described crew members desperately applying pressure to the wounds while the captain turned toward shore and radioed emergency services. To me, this is the most devastating part of the whole thing. Everyone did exactly what they were supposed to do after the moment Noah entered the water. Nobody delayed. The reality was just brutal. His injuries were too massive to survive. Even with paramedics waiting at the harbor and trauma surgeons working on him the second he hit the hospital, Noah died just a few hours later. The post-mortem examination documented catastrophic injuries to the upper leg and pelvic region, major vascular trauma, extensive soft tissue damage, and hemorrhagic shock caused by massive blood loss. Investigators ultimately concluded that the single bite was responsible for the fatal injuries. Authorities reviewed onboard video footage and witness statements to reconstruct the timeline. The footage confirmed that Noah had voluntarily entered the water moments before the attack. Wildlife officials were never able to identify the specific shark involved, and no unusual shark activity was reported in the area afterward. No further release of the footage was allowed by authorities. It was September 14, 2015, along a quiet stretch of central Florida coastline south of the main tourist beaches, where the afternoon air sat warm and heavy over the water. The day had been bright, but hours of strong wave action had churned the shallows into a clouded brown haze, and dense schools of mullet kept breaking the surface as they pushed parallel to the sand. Zinnia Vale, 24, was a travel and outdoor lifestyle influencer who had spent several years building an audience through beach photography and destination videos. By that year, she had gathered roughly 40,000 followers, enough to turn content creation into her main source of income. People who knew her described her as competitive and hardworking, the kind of person who watched closely which posts performed and which ones did not. I think that detail is important. When standing out is how you make money, it's easy to convince yourself to take one more risk. That summer, her engagement had been slipping, and the travel content space had grown crowded. She was collecting material for a new series on Florida's beaches and wildlife when she reached this stretch of shore. In the days before her visit, migrating mullet had pulled predators close to the beach, and a posted advisory near the access path urged swimmers to use caution during heavy baitfish activity. A lifeguard had also mentioned that conditions were poor and that the water was getting risky. She saw the warning and went in anyway. To me, that's the moment this stopped being bad luck and became a choice. Carrying a waterproof camera, she moved out between knee and waist depth and began filming the schools as they passed along the beach. For the first few minutes, nothing happened. As she stood there, several surfers paddling back to shore told her they were leaving because sharks had been actively chasing the baitfish nearby. She stayed in the water anyway. Other witnesses later recalled the bait repeatedly scattering around her, which is one of the clearest signs that a predator is working an area. Bull sharks are among the most dangerous sharks in shallow, murky water. They tolerate low salinity, patrol close to shore, and hunt aggressively when visibility is poor, striking fast at sudden movement and at the dense bait they follow into knee-deep water. In conditions exactly like that afternoon, a swimmer standing inside a feeding zone faces sharply increased risk. What makes bull sharks especially difficult to spot is that the water they prefer often hides them completely. Heavy rain, stirred-up sand, river outflow, and schools of baitfish can turn the shallows into a place where neither predator nor swimmer can see very far. The strike came as a sudden eruption of water. Witnesses caught only a brief glimpse of a large shark before it disappeared beneath the surface, the entire contact lasting a matter of seconds. The bite tore into Zinnia's upper thigh, severing the femoral artery and removing a large section of tissue, which triggered catastrophic blood loss almost at once. Nearby surfers reacted instantly, paddling to her and supporting her above the surface while shouting for the lifeguards. She remained responsive for a short time, but her condition fell quickly as the bleeding continued. Lifeguards reached her within minutes and brought her to shore, where emergency crews worked to control the hemorrhage before transporting her to a nearby trauma center. Despite aggressive treatment and emergency surgery, she died later that evening. Because she had an online following, news of her death spread through local outlets and online communities, though it stayed mostly regional. Investigators found no evidence of unusual shark behavior. Marine specialists believed a bull shark was the most likely species involved based on the location, the water conditions, and the wound characteristics, though no one could confirm it with certainty. They concluded the attack came from several known risk factors stacking together: murky water, dense baitfish, active predators, and a swimmer who stayed despite repeated warnings. Friends remembered her as ambitious and passionate, someone who sometimes accepted risks that felt manageable in the moment. Her waterproof camera was recovered from the shallows by responders, but authorities never released the recording publicly, both out of respect for her family and because the footage was considered too graphic to share. Looking back, I think this one was avoidable. Zinnia did not wade in planning to take a major risk. She waded in believing she was capturing something unique, and she stayed even after surfers told her to her face that sharks were hunting right where she was standing. That is exactly how a chain of ignored warnings turns into something irreversible. It was August 2nd, 2017, the Outer Banks of North Carolina. The water looks calm, the sky holds clear, and the current underneath runs in directions that have nothing to do with either. After dark, the light drops fast and completely. 2 miles out, there is nothing between you and open Atlantic in any direction. Trevor Hale was 41, a diesel mechanic from a rural county in eastern North Carolina, who had been spearfishing on weekends long enough that it had stopped feeling like something that required much deliberation. He held no formal dive certification from any recognized training body. Everything he knew had been handed to him by older fishermen who worked the same coastline, reinforced by time spent underwater, and confirmed by a long run of weekends where his judgment had held without exception. The problem with a record like that is that it doesn't tell you anything about the one time it won't. He was the kind of person who fixed problems without being asked, who showed up early and didn't talk much about it, and who measured his own competence by what he could manage without help. That track record was real. It had also never been tested in conditions like the ones he was about to enter. He had booked a spot on a small after-hours charter run by an independent operator who advertised open water night hunting through word of mouth. Cash only, no booking platform, no record. The target was reef fish near an abandoned shipping marker nearly 2 miles offshore. The boat was small, the crew was 2 people, and the paying divers numbered 4, including Trevor. Before the boat left the dock, the operator had briefed every diver on the one rule that governed the entire trip. The boundary was a perimeter of illuminated buoys mounted with floodlights. The instruction was simple: stay inside the light. The briefing had not been casual. The operator had explained specifically why the boundary existed. Bull sharks routinely patrolled beyond the reef edge after dark, drawn by years of fish waste discarded by commercial boats working the same area. The light perimeter was not a comfort measure. It was the only reliable separation between the divers and water that had been actively feeding large sharks for years. Adult bull sharks are among the most unpredictable large sharks in nearshore water. They move freely between fresh and salt water, operate without difficulty in low visibility, and exhibit consistent territorial aggression in confined feeding zones. They are documented to strike repeatedly during a single encounter and return to the same target multiple times. The largest specimens recorded near that reef had exceeded 10 feet in length and 500 pounds. Unlike sharks that investigate before committing, bull sharks in active feeding zones respond to stimulus with immediate force. A bleeding stringer of fish in that water column was not bait, it was a trigger. Trevor stayed inside the perimeter until he spotted movement in the unlit water beyond the buoys. He swam approximately 80 feet outside the marked zone, carrying a stringer of bleeding fish attached to his waist, moving away from the only available light source, toward whatever he had seen moving in the dark water beyond the boundary. Other divers reported sudden turbulence beneath him before his flashlight disappeared below the surface. A large bull shark struck from below and severed part of Trevor's leg on initial contact. Blood and movement drew additional animals almost immediately. At least 2 other sharks were observed circling the area within seconds of the first strike. The crew threw a line and worked to recover him, but the current and near-zero visibility made reaching him in time impossible. His body was recovered the following morning, nearly half a mile from where the dive had taken place. What remains difficult about Trevor's case is the stringer. He already had bleeding fish attached to his body when he left the light and swam toward movement in unlighted water. The brief, the boundary, the biology of what was already in that water. None of it was ambiguous. Every one of those conditions on its own would have been enough to give pause. Together, they were a complete picture and he moved toward it anyway. It was May 27, 2018, and the first light of morning was spreading across the water off Maui. The boat sat offshore in water cluttered with suspended debris, streaks of foam, and drifting organic matter moving through the area since a whale carcass had been reported farther offshore the day before. The scent trail alone can pull large scavenging predators in from miles away, especially in Hawaiian waters, where tiger sharks are already a dominant presence. Miranda Haley was 22 years old, a college student from Oregon on a graduation trip to Hawaii with two close friends. She'd spent the week snorkeling, road tripping, filming sunsets, and posting the trip online. The cage dive was supposed to be the final excursion before flying home. She wasn't a trained diver and had never done a shark cage experience before, but she'd booked with an operator advertising beginner-friendly encounters and guaranteed close footage. The company had noted active shark presence but hadn't canceled. The operator reviewed the report that morning. The carcass was believed distant, and early passes showed no unusual clustering. A subtle current shift was misread as routine drift, not a forming scent lane. Conditions seemed manageable. Miranda knew the company had flagged active shark presence, but she still went ahead. It's like she trusted the thrill more than the risk. During setup, before the boat was stabilized and before the crew was fully in position, Miranda entered the partially submerged cage early with her camera already rolling. She wanted footage from the first second. The briefing had covered the basics: stay centered, keep arms inside the bars, wait for crew instruction. But the timing was off. The cage wasn't fully secured, visibility was poor, and the surrounding water carried the kind of scent trail that can turn a routine encounter into a feeding response without warning. Tiger sharks are among the most dangerous large predators in tropical waters. They can grow well past 14 feet, weigh over 1,000 pounds, and don't need clear visibility to find a target. Their sense of smell is exceptional, and their feeding behavior is far less selective than a great white's. Miranda had moved toward the front bars to film downward into the water when the shark came in from below. It was a large tiger shark, estimated at around 12 feet, tracking along the scent lane pushing in with the current beneath the cage. Because of the debris and low visibility, the approach wasn't seen clearly until the last second. Miranda raised her camera for a lower angle and extended her right arm slightly outside the bars. The shark accelerated and struck in one pass. The bite caught her forearm first, then carried upward into her torso as the shark's head hit the cage. The initial contact crushed the forearm, severed the brachial artery, and tore through the upper arm. As the jaws closed deeper into her side, the serrated teeth ripped open the lower chest and abdominal wall, causing massive trauma and rapid bleeding. The force slammed her against the bars and knocked the camera free. The shark released almost immediately and dropped away, leaving Miranda collapsed against the cage as blood spread through the water. This is the kind of attack where every second matters, and they were already behind before it even happened. The crew still had to fully secure the cage before lifting it. By the time Miranda was pulled onto the platform, she had already lost a catastrophic amount of blood. CPR was started, and emergency services were contacted, but the injuries were unsurvivable. She was pronounced dead before evacuation could reach the vessel. In the aftermath, investigators examined why the operation proceeded, despite warnings tied to offshore feeding conditions. Findings pointed to misjudgments, distance estimates, current interpretation, and assuming early conditions reflected overall risk. The company suspended tours pending the outcome. It was July 30th, 2018, somewhere in the Central Pacific, the kind of open water that doesn't have landmarks, doesn't have edges, and doesn't offer anything to hold on to. The night sky and the ocean surface blur together out there in a way that makes it difficult to tell where one ends and the other begins. The vessel was a commercial cargo ship running a standard trans-Pacific route. The water temperature was warm, the swells were moderate, and the night shift had been moving without incident. Nothing about that evening suggested it would end differently than any other. Iskra Velinova Petrescu, 36, worked in cargo auditing aboard the vessel. Her job was documentation, manifests, inventory reconciliation, load verification. She was not a deckhand, not a navigator, and not someone whose role required her to be near the outer railings during nighttime operations. She had been with the shipping company for several years, rotating through different vessels on transoceanic routes. The work was isolating by nature, weeks at sea, limited communication with the outside world, and a daily routine that rarely changed. The outer deck at night was not part of that routine. I think that detail matters more than it might seem at first. The exact sequence of events that led to her going overboard was never fully established. Nighttime operations on cargo vessels involve movement across deck areas that are not always well lit or continuously monitored. Whether she lost footing, misjudged a step near the railing, or encountered some other circumstance was not something the subsequent review could determine with certainty. What the review did establish was that she went into the water unwitnessed and that her absence was not immediately noticed. That gap between when she entered the water and when anyone realized she was gone is where everything that followed became increasingly difficult to reverse. The vessel continued on its heading. No alarm was raised. No one on the night shift registered that anything had changed. Iskra was alone in the open ocean, in darkness, with no flotation device and no signaling equipment. The water was warm enough to delay hypothermia. Under different circumstances, that might have worked in her favor. Here, it only extended the duration of her exposure while the probability of survival decreased rapidly with time. Oceanic whitetip sharks are a known presence in Central Pacific pelagic zones. They have been documented in historical maritime incidents involving prolonged open ocean exposure and have been observed to investigate and sometimes circle surface disturbances over extended periods. Oceanic whitetip sharks can grow to about 6 feet and are known for persistently investigating surface disturbances in open water. No interaction was confirmed here, no remains, no witnesses, but it's hard to ignore what shares that environment, even if only as context. Her absence was discovered when a crew member attempted to reach her for a documentation matter and found her quarters empty. A search of the vessel confirmed she was not on board. The timeline reconstructed afterward suggested she had been in the water for an extended period before the search began. By that point, the conditions around her had created increasing risk with every hour that passed. I keep thinking about that window, the hours between when she went in and when anyone noticed. In open Pacific water at night, that window doesn't stay open long. A search and rescue operation was initiated after the vessel raised the alarm. The search area in open Pacific water at night covered a range that made recovery effectively impossible. No physical evidence was recovered. The incident was formally recorded, and the company reviewed deck access and crew monitoring procedures. The area she likely went overboard from wasn't covered by cameras, so no footage existed. For me, the hardest part about this story is that Iskra didn't make a dramatic decision. She didn't take a calculated risk or push past a warning. She simply ended up in the water, alone, in the dark. It was July 19, 2016, along the murky shallows of a coastal lagoon system on Florida's Atlantic side, where the late-day light had turned the water a flat, tea-colored brown. The tide was shifting, the air thick and humid, and the channels that cut through the lagoon were alive with movement. Dense schools of baitfish flickering near the surface as the day cooled toward evening. It was the kind of place that looks peaceful at a glance and hides almost everything beneath it. Callie Voss, 27, was a social media photographer who spent most of her time documenting beaches, wildlife, and outdoor adventures across the state. She had built a modest following by posting close-up footage of animals and dramatic nature encounters, the kind of images that put viewers right in the middle of something most people only see from a safe distance. Friends described her as fearless, but they also admitted she had a habit of ignoring warnings whenever she thought a risk might produce something unique. That's the lesson here. Fearless and reckless can seem identical until the consequences show up. Callie had spent several days filming around the lagoon, a system already well known for its large population of bull sharks. Local fishermen talked about it openly, describing how the sharks gathered near the channels whenever the tide pushed schools of baitfish into tight, concentrated pockets. More than one person mentioned to her that getting into the water near actively feeding fish was a bad idea, that the lagoon was not the place to be waiting around at the wrong time of day. She listened, but she had grown more interested in capturing footage from inside the water rather than from the safety of the bank, and the warnings did not change that. Near sunset, with the light going golden and the baitfish stacking up in the channel, she waded into the murky, waist-deep water, carrying a waterproof camera. She stayed only 40 or 50 yards out from the bank, close enough to feel safe, far enough to be in the worst of it. The conditions could hardly have been worse. The water was clouded with sediment, visibility was almost nothing, and the dense schools moving through the channel were creating exactly the disturbance that draws predators in close. Fishermen nearby called out again, telling her the bull sharks hunted that stretch regularly. She believed the warnings were exaggerated, the kind of caution locals throw at outsiders, and she kept working to close the distance for the footage she wanted. Bull sharks are widely considered among the most dangerous sharks to humans, precisely because of where they choose to live. Unlike most large sharks, They thrive in shallow, brackish, low-visibility water, the murky lagoons, river mouths, and nearshore channels where people actually swim. They are stocky, powerful, and territorial, and they hunt aggressively in exactly the kind of clouded water where they rely on vibration and movement far more than sight. In a sediment-choked channel full of darting baitfish, any large moving object entering the feeding zone can trigger an aggressive feeding response, and a person standing in the middle of it is just one more source of movement in the dark. It happened fast. A large bull shark moving through the bait struck her with the kind of force that left no chance to react. The bite landed high on her upper thigh, severing the femoral artery and tearing through muscle before the shark vanished back into the murk. In water that clouded, she would never have seen it coming. Just the sudden impact and then the rush of everything going wrong at once. With an injury like that, severe blood loss began almost immediately. The fishermen who had warned her only minutes earlier rushed into the shallows and worked to drag her toward the bank, shouting for help as they went, but the bleeding was far beyond anything they could control on a muddy shoreline at sunset. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but the injuries were unsurvivable, and she died before anything more could be done. Investigators recovered her camera later during a search of the area, though authorities never publicly discussed what the device had recorded. In the aftermath, local officials renewed their warnings about entering bait-rich water during feeding periods, especially in lagoon systems known for large shark populations, though for the people who fished there, none of it was new information. Looking back, this one follows the same pattern as so many of these stories. Callie was not ambushed in unfamiliar territory. She was warned repeatedly by people who knew the water about the exact danger that killed her, and she waded in anyway for a closer shot. She did not believe the lagoon was as dangerous as the locals said, and that disbelief is what put her in the water at the worst possible moment. It was May 6, 2013, and a light onshore breeze carried the smell of wet earth and river sediment across the western coastline of Réunion Island, a small French overseas territory in the Indian Ocean east of Madagascar. The overnight rains had sent plumes of brown runoff streaming from the island's steep, volcanic interior into the ocean, carrying nutrients and organic matter that spread a murky haze across the nearshore waters. The turbid conditions drew baitfish close to the river mouths, and behind them, larger predators. Cassien Dubreuil was a 22-year-old surfer from Lyon, France, who had traveled to Réunion 3 weeks earlier as part of a gap year. Dubreuil had been surfing since the age of 14 and considered himself competent in moderate conditions, though his experience was largely confined to the well-patrolled beaches of the French Atlantic coast and the warm, clear waters of Southeast Asia. Réunion's coastline was different. The island lacked the protective barrier reef systems that shielded neighboring Mauritius, meaning deep oceanic water reached close to shore. The volcanic seafloor dropped steeply, creating conditions where large sharks could hunt within yards of the lineup. The island had experienced a sharp increase in shark encounters over the preceding 3 years, prompting authorities to post warning signs at several popular surf breaks and implement seasonal swimming restrictions. Multiple serious and fatal attacks had made Réunion one of the most statistically dangerous surfing regions during that period. Dubreuil had been warned. Wilfried Dejou, a 58-year-old surf shop owner near Saint-Gilles, had spoken with Dubreuil when he came in to rent a board several days earlier. Dejou had pointed out the posted warnings and told him which breaks locals had abandoned, particularly during rain and runoff when visibility dropped to nothing. Dubreuil had listened, but expressed confidence that the conditions looked manageable. On the morning of the attack, Dubreuil paddled out alone at a break roughly a mile south of Saint-Gilles. The spot was known among locals for its consistent swell, but had been largely abandoned by resident surfers due to its proximity to a river mouth that discharged directly into the lineup after rain. The water was brown and opaque from the previous night's runoff. The early morning light was flat and low, and visibility beneath the surface was reduced to near zero. No other surfers were in the water. Tiger sharks are powerful, broad-bodied predators that thrive in warm, turbid coastal waters, reaching lengths of 12 to 14 feet and weights approaching 1,400 pounds. They are the species commonly implicated in fatal attacks around Réunion, where the combination of murky water, steep nearshore bathymetry, and abundant prey creates ideal hunting conditions. Tiger sharks attack from below or behind, using low visibility conditions to approach undetected before delivering a single catastrophic bite with their distinctively shaped, heavily serrated teeth. These teeth are designed to shear through large prey, including sea turtles and marine mammals, and can inflict massive tissue destruction in a single pass. In turbid water, a surfer's silhouette on the surface can resemble common prey such as turtles. 2 surfers watching from shore were the only witnesses. According to their accounts, the attack happened without any visible warning. One moment, Dubreuil was sitting on his board in the lineup. The next, the water broke violently beneath him. The shark struck from directly below, its momentum carrying both predator and victim partially above the surface before crashing back down. The impact knocked Dubreuil from his board. The water around him immediately turned dark. There was no prolonged struggle. The disturbance subsided quickly. His board, severed leash still attached, washed ashore shortly afterward with a large curved section missing from the tail, consistent with a large shark. Emergency services launched a water search within 30 minutes. Partial remains were recovered later that day, or the following day, in shallow water south of the break, the injuries consistent with a single massive bite to the torso that likely caused rapid incapacitation. Investigation noted that he had entered the water alone at a break with posted shark warnings during peak risk conditions of low visibility, river runoff, and low-angle morning light. The incident prompted further restrictions in the area. It was October 3, 2018, the Florida Panhandle coast. October is the quietest month on that stretch of shoreline. The summer crowds are gone, the water has cooled just enough to feel different, and the fall fish migrations bring activity close to shore that draws serious fishermen and very little else. The beach access roads that were full 3 months earlier are nearly empty. The light sits lower in the afternoon sky, and the Gulf takes on a darker, greener color that it doesn't have in summer. The pier itself had been abandoned for years, its structure weathered down to bare pilings that still held the current in ways that made the surrounding water productive for anyone who knew how to read it. Gulls gathered along the old crossbeams at dusk. The warning signs posted along the beach that week were the only thing that had changed. Caleb Drummond was 29. A roofing contractor from a small town in southern Alabama who drove out to that stretch of Gulf coastline near the abandoned pier every fall when the tarpon run came through. He had learned the spot from an uncle years earlier and had returned to it enough times to know the current by reading the surface. He knew where the fish stacked, which side of the pier structure held bait longest, and how the tide affected the window. He arrived mid-morning, set his cooler and tackle near the waterline, and worked the shoreline methodically the way someone does when they've done the same thing enough times that the routine itself is part of the draw. He was not a thrill seeker by any measure. He wore his harness at elevation on job sites, showed up before the crew, and didn't cut corners on work that mattered. He was simply very comfortable in that stretch of water, the kind of comfort people develop after being there many times without anything going wrong. But that week was different. Large great hammerhead sharks had moved unusually close to shore, following massive schools of tarpon near the old pier, and warning signs had been posted telling people to stay out of the water. The signs were visible from the access point. Caleb had read them before he set up his gear. What I notice about Caleb is that he absorbed the warning as information about the water in general, not about what he was specifically about to do in it. He wasn't swimming. He was fishing from the bank. For most of the afternoon, that distinction held. Great hammerhead sharks are capable of exceeding 18 feet in length and 1,000 pounds. The structure of their head, the wide, flattened cephalofoil, provides precise lateral turning control in shallow water, an advantage that becomes consequential during active pursuit of prey near the surface. Their electroreceptors, spread across the width of that distinctive head, allow them to detect the faint electrical signals of prey buried in sand or concealed in murky current. In conditions involving concentrated bait, blood dispersion, and an injured fish sending irregular vibrations through the water column, a hammerhead doesn't circle and assess. It commits. They are not generally aggressive toward humans in open water, but in conditions involving concentrated bait activity, an injured fish on a line, and current-driven blood dispersion moving through a shallow column, the animal in pursuit does not stop to distinguish between its target and whatever else enters its path. The pursuit is already committed before the contact happens. By late afternoon, the bait activity near the old pilings had intensified. Small mullet were breaking the surface in tight clusters, pushed from below. The water directly offshore had taken on a slight discoloration, the kind that comes from churned-up sand and biological activity concentrated in one area. Several other fishermen along the bank had gone quiet, watching it. A hooked tarpon snapped Caleb's line roughly 40 yards offshore. He waded into chest-deep water toward the drifting line, carrying a second rod. People on the bank called out as he entered. He was already moving. A great hammerhead pursuing the injured tarpon accelerated through the bait cloud beneath the surface and made contact with Caleb before biting into his torso and shoulder during the momentum of the feeding run. Currents and blood in the water made it impossible for nearby fishermen to reach him safely until the shark moved away. He was airlifted to a regional trauma center but died that evening. It was July 14, 2017, and a sharp winter wind was sweeping across the southern coast of Gansby, cutting through the small harbor town about 2 hours southeast of Cape Town. Gansby sits right next to a stretch of ocean known as Shark Alley, a narrow channel between Dyer Island and Geyser Rock where thousands of Cape Fur seal make their home. And where there are seals, there are great white shark. Lots of them. Paige Kendrick was 24 years old, a travel content creator from Brisbane, who had spent the last 8 months working her way across the African continent. She'd done the safari circuit in Kenya, climbed Mount Kilimanjaro, hiked through Namibia, and now she was at what she'd been calling the grand finale of her trip. Her followers had voted on the final adventure through an Instagram poll a few weeks earlier, and shark cage diving in Gansby had won by a landslide. And look, I'm not going to sit here and pretend I haven't watched 100 travel videos myself. They are actually incredible. But Paige was about to find out what happens when one rule gets ignored for even a few seconds. The operator she'd booked with was a well-established company that had been running tours in the area for over a decade. The morning briefing covered everything you'd expect. Keep your body centered in the cage, hands behind the bars. Don't grab the bait line. And critically, the top hatch of the cage would be opened and closed throughout the day as divers rotated in and out, so anyone inside needed to stay low and away from the opening when it was unsecured. Paige was in the second rotation that morning, sharing the cage with 3 other tourists. She'd brought a GoPro on a short pole and was planning to film vertical content for her stories. Above them, the crew had just finished pulling the bait line away after a pass and assumed the shark had dropped deeper and moved off the pattern. There was a brief exchange on deck, half heard over wind and engine noise, about rotating the next group. Believing they had a short window, one crew member cracked the hatch open early. Great white sharks are vertical ambush predators by design. They hunt seals by tracking them from the dark water below, then launching upward in a single explosive burst that can carry their entire body clear of the surface. It's called breaching, and Gansby is one of the only places on Earth where it happens with regularity. The shark hadn't left. The same large female, estimated at around 15 feet, had dipped out of sight only seconds earlier, then circled back deeper and faster than expected. Paige, now closer to the front, lifted her GoPro slightly toward the opening, just as the shadow came back up from below. What happened next wasn't clean. The shark surged upward and collided with the cage at an angle, its snout and upper body forcing partially through the open hatch. The impact drove the top bars downward and slammed Paige forward into the frame, pinning her upper body between the metal and the animal's head. The cage jolted violently. One diver lost grip and struck the side rail. Another inhaled water in the confusion. As the shark thrashed to pull free, its jaws snapped reflexively, catching Paige high along the shoulder and side of the neck. Not a clean bite, but enough to tear through soft tissue and muscle. The force twisted her sideways against the bars. Blood spread instantly into the water as the animal struggled against the cage opening. The entire sequence lasted only a few seconds, but inside the cage it felt much longer. When the shark finally wrenched itself free, the cage rocked hard enough to momentarily submerge the opening. Paige slipped downward, unresponsive, partially folded against the lower bars. The other divers were shouting, trying to stabilize themselves as the crew scrambled above. The cage was hauled up quickly, but by the time they got her clear of the water, Paige had already lost consciousness. The combination of traumatic injury, rapid blood loss, and water aspiration made resuscitation unsuccessful. She was pronounced dead on the deck before emergency services could be reached. The investigation that followed focused heavily on the timing of the hatch opening relative to the shark's last confirmed position. It wasn't outright recklessness, but a breakdown in communication and assumption, crew believing the animal had cleared the area when it hadn't. The operator suspended tours immediately and cooperated fully with maritime authorities. Paige wasn't just diving, she was chasing the perfect shot. That slight shift put her out of position at the worst moment, a reminder that one better angle can meet a moment with no second chances. It was November 2nd, 2015, along South Africa's KwaZulu-Natal coast, where rough surf and poor visibility are common. Recent rainfall and river outflow had reduced visibility to about 1 to 2 meters, 3 to 6 feet, and concentrated baitfish near shore. The current was uneven, the water murky, and the light still low when Tavian Xerxes Malcor entered the water. Tavian, 27, was an underwater photographer working independently along the KwaZulu-Natal coast. He wasn't attached to any publication or research institution. He sold his work through a small personal portfolio and a modest online following. He specialized in capturing predator activity in dynamic environments, actively seeking out conditions most divers avoided. To me, that's what separated him. He was willing to go where the shot was, even when the conditions made it complicated. He had been working this coastline for several months, building familiarity with local water patterns and seasonal behavior. That familiarity had been reinforced by months of successful dives in similar conditions. And I think that's the part worth paying attention to. Not that he was reckless, but that experience had quietly narrowed the gap between caution and confidence. The rainfall earlier that week had altered the environment in ways not immediately visible from the surface. River outflows along this stretch concentrate bait fish near shore, and where bait fish concentrate, larger predators follow. The current near the outflow pushed debris and sediment in unpredictable directions, and the water carried the kind of murk that makes every shape below the surface uncertain. Tavion entered the surf zone without a dive partner, though a spotter remained on the beach tracking his position intermittently. He timed his entry between wave sets, managing the camera rig through the surf before moving toward the area where baitfish activity had been visible from shore. Looking at this now, the combination of factors that morning was more significant than any single one of them. The outflow, the baitfish, the low visibility, each one manageable on its own. Together, they were something else. Bull sharks are a year-round presence here, with activity increasing in murky, low salinity conditions and concentrated baitfish. In low visibility, they rely on electroreception and pressure sensing, and a diver repeatedly surfacing can produce signals that draw close-range investigation, often faster than it can be detected from above. Tavion had been in the water for approximately 20 to 30 minutes, repeatedly diving and resurfacing to capture footage of the baitfish activity below. The irregular movement pattern continued in water where visibility offered almost nothing beyond arm's reach. The shark struck laterally at close range and disengaged immediately after the bite, consistent with investigatory behavior in low visibility conditions. The injury was significant, major vascular damage to his lower body. This is the part that stands out. Proximity to shore did not translate to survivability. The spotter on the beach registered the disturbance in the surf zone and raised the alarm immediately. Bystanders entered the turbulent surf despite the risk and brought Tavion to shore within minutes. Attempts were made to control the bleeding, while emergency services were contacted. Despite the speed of the response, the blood loss could not be managed with the resources available on the beach. He lost signs of life despite continued attempts at resuscitation and was later formally pronounced dead. His camera equipment was recovered from the water later that day. The footage was reviewed as part of the incident documentation and was not released publicly. For me, the hardest part about this story is that Tavion understood that environment better than most people who enter that water. He had spent months learning that coastline, and experience slowly convinced him the variables would remain manageable. It was November 14th, 2021, far offshore in the deep blue water of the Bahamas, miles from the nearest land, where the surface stretched out flat and endless under a bright afternoon sun. The water here ran thousands of feet deep, a rich electric blue with no bottom in sight, the kind of open ocean that looks calm and inviting right up until you remember what moves through it. Sorelve, 29, was a travel influencer who specialized in extreme adventure content. She had built her audience on footage that looked more daring than what other creators were posting. The kind of clips that made followers stop scrolling, and she was always chasing the next one. Crew members and guides who worked with people like her often described her as someone who disliked following restrictions, who treated safety rules as obstacles between her and the shot she wanted. That is the core of what happened here, because in most environments a person can bend the rules and get away with it, but the open ocean does not grade on a curve. That day, Sorel had joined a small offshore shark diving charter operating far from land, the kind run by independent operators who take experienced divers out to controlled, baited encounters. Before the boat ever left the dock, the crew gave a detailed safety briefing. They were specific about it. Nobody was permitted to enter the water outside the supervised sessions, because oceanic whitetips were regularly encountered in the area during offshore dives, and these were not animals to be in the water with casually or alone. The rules existed for one reason: to keep every diver within sight and within reach of the crew at all times. Sorel listened to the briefing along with everyone else, and then, when it mattered, she ignored it. The supervised dive went as planned. Afterward, the passengers climbed back aboard and began the ordinary work of storing gear and rinsing equipment. The dive master had gone below briefly to help a passenger with a stuck wetsuit zipper, while the deckhands were occupied rinsing tanks on the far side of the vessel. It was a narrow window, less than 3 minutes by later estimates, but it was enough. Sorrel slipped over the side on the opposite end of the boat, quietly, without her fins, carrying only her action camera on a floating rig. She wanted footage of herself alone in the open ocean, suspended over thousands of feet of blue with no guides and no other divers in the frame. The deckhand spotted her almost immediately, maybe 90 seconds after she entered the water, and shouted for the dive master. By then, she had drifted perhaps 20 feet from the hull, not far in distance, but far enough that the current was already working against her. The dive master surfaced topside within seconds and began calling to her to return to the boat. What happened in the next several minutes is where accounts differ slightly, but the broad sequence is consistent across crew testimony. She was swimming back toward the vessel, or attempting to, when the shark arrived. Oceanic white-tip sharks are among the most dangerous open ocean predators in the world, reaching lengths of around 10 to 13 feet and built for a habitat where food is scarce and widely scattered. Unlike reef sharks, they live in the open blue where meals are rare, which makes them bold, persistent, and methodical investigators of anything that might be edible. They are known for approaching slowly, then circling and bumping a target, testing it, and they do not spook easily once they have committed their attention. They are also the sharks most often linked to attacks on isolated people far from shore. In deep offshore water, a lone person at the surface, moving and splashing, is exactly the kind of curiosity these sharks are wired to pursue. The baited dive earlier in the afternoon had already drawn at least one into the area and kept it close. The crew threw a flotation ring, and the dive master entered the water immediately to assist her. The shark had already made contact by the time he reached her. He managed to get between the animal and Sorrel and got her to the swim platform, but the initial injury was severe. The crew had emergency oxygen and a trauma kit aboard, standard equipment on reputable charters, and they used both while pushing the vessel to full throttle toward shore. The Coast Guard was reached by radio within minutes. None of it was enough. She died before any additional medical help could reach her. Looking back, this one falls almost entirely on a choice. Sorrel was not failed by her crew or surprised by unusual animal behavior. She deliberately slipped into open ocean alone, against an explicit briefing. In water everyone on that boat knew held oceanic white tips. She wanted an image of herself, isolated in the blue, and the ocean gave her exactly that. It was April 29, 2018, coastal Louisiana. The roads out there run flat and straight through stretches of marsh that look the same in every direction, and the facilities that operate along them tend to sit back from the road behind small signage and long gravel driveways. From the outside, they look like any other low-profile commercial operation. What's inside the tanks is a different matter entirely. Victor Baines was 52, a marine animal handler who had spent more than a decade at a small privately operated aquatic facility in coastal Louisiana. The staff there knew him as the person who stayed calm when things went sideways, not because he was indifferent to risk, but because he had encountered most versions of it already and knew how to move through them. Quiet, methodical. The last person in the building anyone expected to be the one who didn't come back out of the water. Newer handlers watched how he moved around the enclosures and took their cues from it. He had helped develop much of the facility's operational protocol himself, including the specific safety procedures governing the main shark enclosure. He knew what the rules were because he had written them, and he knew why they existed because he had been there long enough to understand what they were designed to prevent. The largest animal in that enclosure was a bull shark, 10 feet long, approximately 350 pounds, housed in a saltwater tank alongside several smaller specimens. Bull sharks in captive enclosures do not behave the way open water sharks are sometimes assumed to behave. They do not habituate to human presence in ways that reduce their reactivity. They remain territorial, stimulus responsive, and capable of explosive aggression without the graduated behavioral buildup that might give a handler time to withdraw. In the period immediately following a feeding cycle, that reactivity is significantly elevated. The sensory state triggered by feeding takes time to subside, and animals that have recently eaten continue operating at heightened alertness, reactive to contact and unexpected movement in ways that a handler entering the water needs to account for precisely. Facility policy addressed this directly: no solo entry into the main enclosure, and no entry within 30 minutes of a completed feeding cycle. Victor had been part of drafting both rules. That afternoon, he entered the enclosure alone to clear debris from a filtration grate. Security footage later showed him moving methodically along the tank wall, working the way a person moves through a task they have completed many times without incident. The water inside the tank had turned murky, the kind of low visibility that's common in saltwater enclosures right after feeding, with tiny particles floating everywhere and visibility dropping to only a few feet. He also hadn't waited for the standard 30-minute post-feeding window to pass before entering the tank. There was no record that he had considered it a meaningful variable that afternoon. The thing that stays with me about Victor is that he wasn't being careless in the way that word usually gets applied. He wasn't rushing, wasn't distracted, and wasn't dismissing what the animal was capable of. He had simply been safe for long enough that the protocol had stopped feeling like a barrier between him and something that could kill him. It had become administrative. That is a different problem, and it is much harder to see from the inside. Investigators concluded the shark became agitated when Victor made accidental contact with it in the murky water near the tank wall. The animal struck and held him against the enclosure structure. The confined space offered no room to maneuver. The disturbance drew activity from additional animals in the connected sections of the system, compounding the situation in the way that confined multi-animal enclosures can when the water changes character suddenly. By the time other workers noticed the discoloration spreading through the tank and activated the emergency lift system, Victor had sustained injuries that were not survivable. It was June 14, 2026, in the cold, murky water of False Bay, South Africa, where the morning had opened overcast and still. Overnight currents had pulled sediment-heavy water across the filming zone, dropping visibility beneath the surface to somewhere between 10 and 15 feet. The production was a survival thriller filming its most expensive underwater sequence, involving stunt divers moving through an artificial submerged shipwreck set. The schedule had already slipped twice. The filming permit expired within 48 hours. Poor weather was forecast for the rest of the week, and the marine support crew was contracted only through Friday. 5 stunt divers had been assigned to the sequence. Thayer Vossen, 43, coordinated the operation from the surface. Brennick Solari, 28, Corwin Dragor, 31, Tavrin Kest, 35, and Osric Vale, 33, were the 4 entering the water. Merrick Halden, 55, served as the production's marine safety consultant, a former research vessel captain with decades of experience in South African coastal waters. Brennick's position matters. In stunt work, reputation often goes to those willing to take the risk. Local operators had logged shark sightings near seal colonies along the southern edge of the bay in the days before filming. Merrick recommended keeping the dedicated recovery vessel at anchor within the zone at all times and advised postponing if conditions deteriorated. Management concluded existing procedures were adequate to continue. That morning, the recovery vessel had been reassigned to collect replacement lighting equipment damaged earlier in the week. It had not returned by the time diving began. 30 minutes before the dive, a spotter observed a large dorsal fin approximately 200 yards from the set. When it disappeared, management determined the risk remained acceptable and authorized the dive. A confirmed sighting. Poor visibility. No recovery vessel. The outcome was being invited in. Brennick, Corwin, Tavrin, and Osric entered the water together and moved into position around the shipwreck structure. Great white sharks hunt using a single explosive ambush strike from depth, accelerating upward with enough force to be nearly impossible to detect before contact. In water below 15 feet of visibility, a diver in a dark wetsuit moving along a submerged structure produces a silhouette. The animal is wired to pursue. It does not distinguish. It commits. At 9:15 in the morning, Brennick had moved slightly away from the group while repositioning a guide marker along the outer edge of the set. A large, great white surged from below and struck him with full force, inflicting catastrophic injuries to his torso and lower body. Emergency recall signals fired immediately. Corwin and Tavern were closest and moved toward him at once. As they worked to secure Brennick and pull him toward the recovery line, the blood, movement, and deploying flotation equipment kept the shark close. It made a second high-speed pass through the group. Corwin sustained severe injuries to one leg. Tavren suffered major trauma to his shoulder and upper arm. Osric was filming from another position near the wreck when the recall reached him. As he moved toward the group to assist, the shark made one final brief pass. The bite caught his lower leg before the animal disappeared into deeper water. The entire sequence lasted only a few minutes. 4 stuntmen injured in one unraveling emergency. The shark struck once and stayed close because everything happening in that water told it to. The rest followed from the chaos. All 4 were brought toward the surface simultaneously. During the evacuation, Corwin became entangled in a temporary guide cable left attached to the shipwreck frame after an equipment relocation earlier that week. Already losing blood rapidly, he became trapped long enough for rescuers to lose visual contact in near-zero visibility caused by disturbed sediment. He was eventually located and freed, but the combination of blood loss, entanglement, and time underwater had already decided the outcome. Corwin Dragor died before reaching shore. Brennick Solari was declared dead shortly after being brought aboard the support vessel. Tavern survived after extensive surgery. Osric survived following multiple reconstructive procedures. 1 shark, a few minutes, 2 dead. The attack happened in the water. The mistake happened on land. Investigators cited the recovery vessel's absence, the unsecured guide cable, and the decision to continue diving after the morning sighting as primary contributing factors. The film was permanently abandoned. Footage recovered from underwater equipment was reviewed during the inquiry but never publicly released, with the production company citing active litigation and the wishes of both families. It was September 11th, 2015, and a warm Atlantic breeze was rolling across the shoreline of Cocoa Beach, Florida, just as the boat carrying Elena Riggs and her dive group reached the near-shore drop-off about 3/4 of a mile out. It's not a place anyone with experience would call safe for casual diving. Elena was 34 years old, a high school biology teacher from Orlando, who had been certified as an open water diver for almost 6 years. She wasn't reckless, and her social media wasn't full of dangerous stunts. What she didn't have, though, was experience with cage work, especially not with the kind of low-visibility, predator-attracting setup this operator was running. She'd booked the trip with 2 friends as a long-planned birthday weekend. The morning briefing had been short, almost casual. The crew explained the ladder transition system they used, where divers would rotate in and out of the cage one at a time, using a fixed metal ladder attached to the side. They warned the group to move quickly through the ladder zone and to keep all limbs inside the structure during the swap. What they didn't emphasize strongly enough, and what later turned out to be the central failure of the operation, was that limited chumming had already been introduced earlier to draw in sharks, and that feeding activity was developing below the boat. What made the setup more dangerous wasn't just the presence of chum, but the conditions around it. Visibility that morning was especially poor. Green, sediment-heavy water with only a few feet of clarity, and there was no dedicated spotter assigned to monitor the ladder zone. Anything approaching from below would have been effectively invisible until it was already within striking distance. It's hard not to see this as negligence. Even a moderate attractant setup, paired with blind water and unmonitored entry points, creates conditions that make transition points vulnerable. Bull sharks are widely considered one of the 3 most dangerous shark species on the planet, alongside great whites and tigers. They typically grow between 7 and 11 feet long and can weigh upwards of 500 pounds, with a bite force per square inch that's higher relative to body size than a great white. What makes them especially dangerous is their tolerance for shallow, murky water, their ability to thrive where visibility is near zero, and an aggression level documented in coastal attack reports. Elena was the second diver to swap out of the cage that morning. She'd finished her rotation and was at the ladder, partially out of the water, with her upper body above the surface and her legs still submerged inside the ladder frame. She paused for a few extra seconds, holding her phone in a waterproof case to film a quick clip of herself with the boat in the background. From below, the ladder area would have appeared as a broken silhouette against a dim surface, distorted by turbidity and glare. With no spotter calling out movement, no one registered what was rising beneath her. Below her, a bull shark estimated at around 9 feet had been drawn into the area. It came up fast and vertical, locked onto the silhouette of her lower body against the surface light. The strike hit her across the abdomen and lower torso in a single bite. The teeth tore through her wetsuit, opened her abdominal wall, and severed major vessels along the iliac branch. The force slammed her against the ladder, and the shark released almost immediately, disappearing back into the murk without a second pass. Elena collapsed inward against the ladder, her lower body trailing blood into the water. The crew dragged her onto the platform within 20 seconds, but the internal damage was catastrophic. She lost consciousness on the deck and was pronounced dead before the boat could reach shore. Elena's family released a quiet statement thanking the dive community and asking for privacy. Local officials posted warnings along that stretch of coast for the rest of the season. Do you think the blame in Elena's case rests more on the operator's unsafe setup or on the decision to let divers enter the water under those conditions? It was September 9th, 2016, along the Zambezi River in a stretch of floodplain, overtaken by seasonal overflow. The water was the color of wet clay, moving fast and carrying everything the land had surrendered: sediment, debris, uprooted vegetation. Visibility near the surface was already poor. Below the waterline, it was effectively zero. Eloan Mireth Varga, 31, was a field audio technician contracted through a small environmental research outfit specializing in freshwater acoustic monitoring. She wasn't a diver or a field biologist. She was the person who made sure the equipment worked. Hydrophones, cables, signal recorders. She understood sound better than she understood rivers, and that distinction mattered more than anyone acknowledged before she entered the water. The flooding that season had been heavier than projected, pushing several hydrophones out of position. Someone needed to go in and adjust them. Honestly, I think this is where it starts. Not a bad decision, just a routine one that nobody questioned. The rest of the team stayed upriver, assuming she'd be back in a few minutes. No one maintained line of sight. It wasn't dramatic negligence. It was the kind of assumption that forms when something has worked enough times that it stops feeling like a risk at all. She waded in alone toward the hydrophone, working along a shallow bank that dropped abruptly into a deeper channel just a few feet ahead, the kind of drop-off where footing gives way without warning and the current pulls harder toward the channel. In clear water, that edge would have been visible. In flood conditions, it wasn't something you found until you were already past it. In river systems like this, large predators don't need visibility to locate movement. Bull shark, a stocky, highly adaptable predator, known for tolerating fresh water and using electroreception to detect prey in murky conditions, has been documented far inland, especially during high water conditions when access routes expand. They rely on electroreception, detecting the electrical signals produced by muscle movement, allowing them to investigate targets at close range in completely opaque water. The attack happened at that edge where the riverbed dropped away. As her footing gave way into the deeper channel, the sudden displacement of water and rapid movement coincided with the shark's approach. The initial contact was forceful and close range, not a clean strike, but a crushing bite to the lower body that immediately destabilized her. The water around her churned violently as she tried to regain footing, but the current was already pulling her off balance. There was at least one additional contact in the seconds that followed. Not a prolonged feeding event, but a rapid, chaotic sequence of bite and release behavior, typical of investigatory attacks. The injuries were catastrophic. Severe tissue damage and rapid blood loss occurred almost immediately, compounded by the current dragging her further into the channel. With no stable footing and no visibility, there was no opportunity to orient herself or escape the area. By the time the water settled, there was nothing visible from the surface to indicate what had just happened. Her absence was noticed within several minutes, but locating her took longer. The team moved along the bank, searching through debris and murky water until they found her caught against submerged vegetation, partially held in place by the current. Basic first aid was attempted, but the extent of blood loss made intervention impossible in the field. The remoteness of the location delayed evacuation, and she was pronounced dead before reaching the nearest clinic. The research project was suspended. The organization released a brief internal statement and quietly closed the site. No footage existed. The recording equipment she had gone in to adjust remained submerged, capturing nothing useful. Her name appeared in a regional incident log, and little else. A regional log entry, a closed site, like the river just swallowed everything and moved on. It was March 8, 2014, and the sun hung low over the Tuamotu archipelago of French Polynesia, casting amber light across the shallow lagoon of a remote coral atoll. The dry season had brought calm seas and exceptional water clarity to the outer reef, drawing both fish and fishermen to the deep passes where tidal currents funneled nutrients between the open ocean and the lagoon interior. Tawanui Mahitu was a 34-year-old spearfisherman from a small village on the atoll's northern shore. A man who had grown up freediving the reefs and passes since childhood. Spearfishing was both livelihood and identity for Mahitu, who supplied reef fish to the village and for a small-scale sale to markets in Papeete. He was one of the most capable freedivers on the atoll, routinely working depths of 60 feet and reaching 80 on his deeper dives. That afternoon, Mahitu departed alone in his outrigger canoe for a deep pass on the atoll's western side, where he had been targeting large grouper over the previous week. He carried a single spear gun, a dive knife, and a float line attached to a surface buoy. His wife, Haranui, expected him back before dark. The pass dropped to approximately 70 feet at its deepest point, with strong tidal currents pulling nutrient-rich water toward the open ocean. These currents attracted schools of reef fish, which in turn drew larger predators during the transitional hours around dawn and dusk. Every spearfisherman on the atoll understood that the passes grew dangerous as light faded, but the late afternoon current also brought the largest fish into range. According to the reconstruction that investigators assembled over the following days, Mahitu had anchored his canoe near the mouth of the pass and entered the water sometime in the mid to late afternoon. His float buoy was later recovered approximately 300 yards from the canoe, drifting in the outgoing current. The spear gun was recovered by local divers from the seafloor at a depth of 65 feet, its shooting line deployed. The remaining portion of a grouper was found nearby on the reef, still attached to a severed section of float line. The damage to the fish was consistent with a large shark having torn it from the line. Tiger sharks are among the most versatile and dangerous predators in tropical waters, with adults commonly reaching 12 to 14 feet in length and weights between 850 and 1,400 pounds. Often called the garbage cans of the sea, Tiger sharks are indiscriminate feeders known to consume fish, sea turtles, birds, marine mammals, and carrion. They are particularly attracted to the vibrations and blood trails produced by spearfishing activity, and competition over speared fish is a well-documented trigger for dangerous encounters. Unlike great whites, tiger sharks do not rely on a single ambush strike. They are persistent hunters, capable of circling, investigating, and attacking multiple times. Their broad, heavily serrated teeth are designed for shearing rather than puncturing, capable of cutting through bone, shell, and cartilage with equal efficiency. What happened beneath the surface of the pass that afternoon was never directly witnessed. Based on the physical evidence, investigators concluded that Mahitu had speared a large grouper at depth and was ascending with the catch when a tiger shark, likely attracted by the struggling fish and the blood dispersing in the current, was drawn to the catch and engaged with the line. The severed float line and damage to the grouper indicated the shark had struck the catch first. Whether the subsequent attack on Mahitu was immediate or followed a period of circling could not be determined. The strong tidal currents flowing through the pass would have dispersed blood and organic material within minutes, carrying evidence into open water and making detailed scene reconstruction nearly impossible. Mahitu did not return by nightfall. Haranui raised the alarm, and a search party launched at first light. His canoe was later found drifting, its anchor line no longer holding. The float buoy, spear gun, and damaged catch were recovered over the course of the day, scattered across a dispersed area of the pass. Despite an extensive search of the surrounding reef and pass, only fragments of Mahitu's wetsuit and dive belt were ever found. The currents and scavenging activity in the pass had erased nearly everything else. Authorities concluded that Mahitu had died as a result of a shark attack during a spearfishing dive, the damage patterns consistent with a large shark, believed to involve a tiger shark, based on regional prevalence. It was June 11th, 2014, the South Carolina coast. June there is warm without being punishing, the kind of weather that makes a boat trip feel easy, and a sandbar feel like somewhere worth stopping. On a calm morning, the sandbars visible from the boat look almost inviting, shallow, sunlit, the kind of water that doesn't look like it belongs in the same category as open ocean. That appearance is part of what makes them dangerous during migration season. Marissa Kent was 26, a travel content creator from Tucson, Arizona, who had spent 3 years building an audience around access that most people didn't pursue. She wasn't impulsive. People who had collaborated with her described someone who researched locations for weeks before arrival, who packed with a specific shot list in mind, and who made deliberate decisions rather than reactive ones. She had booked this particular tour specifically because the sandbar location was known for high shark concentration during the summer migration window. You see, she was the kind of person who wanted perfection. By now, every trip she planned should have gone exactly as she wanted. This trip also, she had looked it up. She had planned for it. Getting closer than other people got was a professional approach, not a habit, and she had built a following on the results of that approach without serious consequence until that morning. She had booked a spot on a small independent eco-tour operating near a chain of shallow sandbars several hundred yards off the South Carolina coast. The tour advertised close observation of bull sharks moving through warm coastal shallows. The crew had dispersed fish chunks from the boat to concentrate the animals before the viewing window opened. The chum had been working for several minutes by the time the sharks began arriving in visible numbers, tight formations moving through the current in the shallow water around the sandbar, close enough to the surface that their dorsal fins broke the waterline periodically. Before any of that started, every passenger had been told the same thing: remain on the boat. What is notable about Marissa is that she wasn't someone who forgot the instruction or got swept up in a moment of excitement. She heard it, weighed it, decided her reason was sufficient, and entered the water carrying her camera. That level of deliberateness makes this case harder to categorize, not easier. She knew what the water contained. She had booked the tour because of what the water contained. Bull sharks are one of the few shark species genuinely comfortable in shallow coastal water. They are a documented presence in South Carolina coastal shallows during summer months. They are strongly attracted to chum, and they behave differently from most species in a feeding environment. An average adult bull shark runs between 7 and 11 feet and can exceed 500 pounds. They are ambush predators, with some of the highest testosterone levels of any shark species, which directly affects their aggression threshold in a feeding environment. In a well-established chum slick, bull sharks do not circle and assess. They are already oriented toward the source of disruption before anything enters the water. During migration, bull sharks gather in numbers and become extremely sensitive to movement, splashing, and anything disturbing the water's surface. When bait is already spread through the current, anything that enters the water and moves like struggling prey gets treated as part of the feeding environment. The sharks don't stop to analyze what it is. They're already in a heightened feeding state, so anything splashing in from above is simply seen as more prey activity. The sharks make no further distinction beyond that. Marissa entered the waist-deep water carrying a waterproof camera. She had been warned twice before going in. The crew watched her enter. Multiple bull sharks began circling her legs within seconds as drifting bait moved through the current around her. One bull shark struck her upper thigh from below, a feeding strike, consistent with the concentration of stimulus already present in the water. The splashing that followed drew additional bites from animals already operating at elevated agitation. The response was not coordinated, and it was not targeted. It was the predictable output of a feeding environment that had just received a new input. Crew members pulled her back onto the boat as quickly as they could reach her, but the damage to the femoral artery had already caused blood loss that could not be managed before they reached shore. She was in that water for less than a minute. The sharks weren't specifically targeting her. They were already hunting, and she entered the water they were hunting in with a camera in hand, instead of making the one choice that might have changed everything, staying on the boat. It was April 2nd, 2016, and the waters off Grand Bahama carried that steady, rolling movement that doesn't look dangerous until you're in it. The surface reflected a bright, flattened sky, but below, visibility dropped to around 20 to 25 feet, turning everything into shifting shapes and muted outlines. The current moved just enough to keep suspended equipment drifting slightly out of position. This trip wasn't advertised as a standard cage dive. The operator framed it as something more immersive, a modified setup designed to reduce visual obstruction and bring divers closer to the animals. Less steel, wider spacing, and a more open feel compared to traditional cages. Silas Mercer was 38, working a physically demanding job that didn't leave him much time for trips like this. When he did take one, he didn't want a watered-down version of the experience. People who knew him described him as someone who preferred things done fully. If there was a way to get closer, he would take it. I've reported on other stories where that same attitude mattered most. People wanted the absolute best experience, and that exact desire ended up being the most important part of what happened. That mindset lined up perfectly with what this operation was offering. The briefing reflected that tone. The crew emphasized awareness and balance, but didn't go deep into how the modified cage changed the level of protection. There was no detailed explanation of spacing tolerances, no comparison to standard safety designs, just a general instruction to stay inside and remain steady. When Silas entered the cage with his waterproof camera, the difference was obvious. The bars were spaced wider than what you'd expect in a typical setup. Not wide enough to step through, but wide enough that the barrier didn't feel solid anymore. When you looked out, the structure almost disappeared, giving a clearer, more direct view into the water. This setup was the perfect setup for photographs. That was the selling point, but it also meant the margin for error was thinner. At first, everything worked the way it was intended. A few sharks passed at a distance, moving in and out of the visibility range. The cage drifted slightly with the current, requiring constant small adjustments in footing. Then a larger tiger shark came into view. Witnesses later estimated it at around 11 to 12 feet, moving slowly along the lower edge of the cage. It didn't charge or rush. It circled, maintaining a controlled distance as it inspected the structure. Silas shifted to follow it. Using his waterproof camera, he took pictures of the animal. He lowered his stance and moved toward the front section where the visibility was best. One hand braced lightly against the bars as the cage moved under him, his focus locked on keeping the shark in frame. He stayed inside. That part never changed. He took photographs, selfies, and videos with the animal right around him. As the shark made another pass, it angled closer to the cage wall. Tiger sharks often investigate by moving along edges, turning slightly inward to test objects in their environment. When it passed the front section, the alignment was there. Silas's upper arm, pressed near the bars for balance, sat within the wider spacing, close enough that part of the soft tissue extended beyond the protective plane of the cage without fully crossing it. It wasn't something he could see. The shark made contact. Not a high-speed strike, but a controlled, investigative bite that became destructive because of the access. The jaws closed across his upper arm, pulling him into the bars as the force pinned him against the frame. The entire sequence lasted only seconds. When the shark released, Silas fell backward inside the cage. From above, the crew saw the disturbance and immediately began pulling the cage up, but retrieval still took time. The movement of the water and the weight of the structure slowed the process just enough to matter. By the time they got him onto the platform, he was already losing consciousness. The injury was high on the arm, near major vessels, making bleeding extremely difficult to control in that environment. The crew attempted emergency measures, but the severity and location of the wound left little room for stabilization. He was pronounced dead before reaching shore. Inspectors documented that the spacing between bars exceeded commonly accepted safety standards for large shark interactions. The structure was identified as a modified configuration that had not undergone formal testing or certification for that type of use. His camera was kept for the sole privacy of the victim. The official conclusion stated that the experimental design reduced the effectiveness of the protective barrier, allowing unintended exposure despite the diver remaining inside the cage. The operation was suspended shortly after. I have been in water where it was hard to see past 20 feet, and it felt creepy. Looking at Silas's situation, those big gaps in the cage would have made me second-guess everything I did. It was April 17, 2014, in the Malay Atoll, a cluster of low-lying islands in the Maldives, where the water is warm and the light drops fast near dusk. What was visible an hour before becomes uncertain, and what was uncertain becomes invisible. That evening, the conditions were unremarkable on the surface. Below it, several things had already shifted. Valrik Dastan Iqbal, 39, was an underwater welder contracted through a small local marine construction outfit working on a pier extension project in the atoll. He was a tradesman, not a recreational diver. His work required operating in confined, low-visibility conditions near submerged structures, and he had been doing it long enough to move through those environments with practiced efficiency. Honestly, that efficiency was probably what made him valuable on a job like this. It was also what made him comfortable in conditions that deserved more caution. The pier extension was on a tight schedule, and the structure had been in the water long enough to attract reef fish. To keep up, Valrik pushed some dives later into the afternoon. There was no consistent shark risk protocol for late-day dives, no dedicated hazard observer beyond standard line supervision, and no deterrent systems in use. This is where the situation started building. Not one decision, but a series of small, reasonable ones. Nearby vessels had been processing fish at the surface throughout the day, routine practice in the area that nobody flagged as relevant to the dive schedule. Tidal movement had been carrying fish waste through the work zone intermittently throughout the afternoon, creating periodic scent trails rather than a constant concentration. By the time Valrik entered the water, those trails had been moving through the area for hours. He entered the water near dusk with a surface tender managing his line and equipment. The light at that depth, at that hour, flattens contrast and compresses distance in ways that are difficult to fully account for from above. Valrik positioned himself against the pier structure to work, facing the surface he was welding. That orientation, fixed, task-focused, facing the structure, significantly limited his awareness of the open water behind him for the duration of the dive. Tiger sharks are a documented presence throughout Maldivian waters. They range widely, move through varied depth zones, and are known to investigate scent cues when those cues intersect with their movement patterns. They are among the larger shark species in the region, commonly reaching 10 to 14 feet in length and weighing between 850 and 1,400 pounds. In low-light conditions, they rely heavily on their lateral line system and electroreception to navigate and investigate unfamiliar signals. I think that's the detail people miss. It wasn't the welder that drew the shark in, it was everything around him, and he happened to be positioned in the middle of it. Tiger sharks often approach cautiously before making contact, though this behavior becomes less consistent in low visibility, scent-active conditions. Any warning in this case would have been limited. A brief pressure shift or movement at the edge of visibility, not enough time to meaningfully react while fixed to the structure. The shark approached from the open water side of the structure. The bite came at close range, a single strike consistent with investigatory behavior in low-light, scent-associated conditions. The injury was consistent with major arterial trauma to the upper leg region. Despite immediate initiation of recovery, extraction from the work position took additional time due to the welding setup and positioning constraints. This is the part that stands out. The response was fast. The distance between fast and fast enough was the problem. The surface tender registered the line disturbance and began recovery immediately. Basic first aid was attempted on the support vessel, but the remoteness of the work site and the distance from any equipped medical facility meant that managing arterial blood loss effectively in the field was not realistic. He died before the vessel reached shore. The marine construction outfit suspended operations operations at the site. A brief internal review was conducted with findings focused on dive scheduling near active fish processing areas and late-day entry protocols. No footage existed. Underwater welding operations at that site were not recorded. The incident appeared in a regional maritime safety log and was not covered beyond local channels. For me, the hardest part about this story is that none of the individual factors, the schedule, the fish processing, the dusk entry, the limited hazard monitoring, would have been enough on their own. It was the combination, and nobody was looking at the combination. Valric went into that water to finish a job, and every decision that put him there at that hour made sense in isolation. His story is a reminder that in underwater work environments, the variables that matter most are often the ones happening outside the immediate task. And by the time those variables become visible, the window to act on them is already gone.